Is Art Flynn, and I'm just getting ready to start to write a story of my father's life over in Ireland. The year was 1861. The city was Tralee, County Kerry. It was on January the 11th at the O'Flynn family that he was born. As a young guy, he used to make his spending money by going out catching wild canaries. They put some kind of a slack, sticky stuff on these trees and limbs, and these birds would light on it, and then they couldn't get off, and they'd go over and pick them up. And that's where he would make his spending money, as he told me. And he used to do an awful lot of swimming in the Shannon River, and he used to go down at the ocean, and he was really a swimmer. He could swim like a fish. And as he was growing up, he used to work in a bakery. And by the time he got to be 18 or 19 years old, he was a baker by trade. And after that, he done any kind of a thing that any young fellow would do. There wasn't much, any kind of jobs for people to do in Ireland. So what they did the best they could, and they just about lived on potatoes, and if they didn't have potatoes, they would have starved to death. The British government was giving them an awful lot of trouble. A lot of them people couldn't earn no money, and people that had homes, old houses, couldn't pay no taxes, and because they couldn't pay taxes, the British government was in there, and what they would do, they'd come along and tear them down and throw the people out in the street. So that really got under my dad's skin. So finally, one evening, they were tearing down the house, so my father and another party went up, and as they were tearing this house down, knocking it down, my dad and this other party run up there with clubs, and they killed a couple of them. And about that time, they had to make a break to get out of there, because if they would have caught them, it would have been just too bad. They probably would have hung them both. So what he did, he ran on down to the waterfront, and he happened to discover down there that there was a big whaling boat just on time at the dock. So he runs up to the dock, and he says, "What's the chance of getting a job on this ship?" And the guy said, "Just a minute, the captain's up there, and I'll call him." So he called the captain hollered down. He says, "What can you do? What kind of work can you do?" Well, he says, "I'm a baker and a cook by trade." Well, he says, "Get the hell on here. We're going to pull off in a few seconds." So he got on, and they sailed out in the ocean whaling for quite a while. And finally, they landed in Boston to pick up supplies for the ship. And at that time, my dad, he left the boat and changed his name also. It wasn't O'Flynn, it was Flynn from then on. And he worked as any kind of a job he could get. And he finally got a job down to where there's a bunch of livery stables. In them days, everybody had horses and carriages, and they'd have these livery stables to take care of them. So anyway, my dad had a job. The first job he had was working in this big livery barn, cleaning barns and wheeling manure out by the wheelbarrow up to railroad cars alongside of this big bunch of barns and horse lots. They had the railroad, so that's where they unload the manure, and they ship it out to the country on these railroad cars. But he worked there for a while, and then pretty soon he figured, well, I want to go on in towards the big cities. So he headed from there, and he went on back, and he got to Elgin, Illinois. And there, he got a job in a bakery there, and he worked there for several months. And he used to tell me that he slept over a place where they made whiskey barrels. He'd be sleeping all day, and about the time they'd get done in the evening, but the time they got done and the noise quit down there here in Poundland, he'd wake up, and then he'd go out, get ready to go to work, because they worked mostly nights making this bread. So anyway, there was a restaurant by the name of Saunders where my father used to eat all his meals, and he ate there for quite a while, and finally there was a young lady there who was a table waiter, and my father got acquainted with her, and they finally got pretty thick. And my aunt happened to notice that. It was her aunt, the Saunders, who she worked for, that owned the restaurant, told her that, asked her, what about this guy that she was talking to and is getting kind of thick with? And she says, his name is Flynn, and she says, was this party, what church does he belong? And my aunt was a Methodist, but my father she says, this James is a Catholic. Well, she says, I don't want you going around with no Catholic. She says, we're a Methodist and we don't believe in going with somebody that it like that. And so my aunt sent my mother back to Waterloo, Iowa, where my mother's folks had this big farm, and back there she went. And finally my father and her, they wrote back and forth, and pretty soon my dad made a trip out to New Hartford to see my mother. And my mother's folks was Ingalls was their name. The same Ingalls, by the way, is one of the Ingalls that was in that show they've had for a long time, Little House on the Prairie. One of her relations was one of the Ingalls that was in that show. So finally, my father would visit her in Iowa there, and pretty soon they decided they'd get married, and they had a wedding. And my father and my mother went back to Elgin, and he had his job there, and they worked there for quite a while. And then finally, they decided they wanted to get into another location, so they left Elgin, and they went into Chicago. And my dad finally rented a building, and he started his own bakery. So they had a bakery business at 47th and Ashland in Chicago. And they run that bakery for quite a long time. And then finally, there was they read the paper where there was opening up a couple cemeteries right out south at 111th. This is in the Chicago limits, 111th Street, right out, well, it was just about the city limits at Mount Greenwood, Illinois. So they go out there and they rented a building that was there, and they opened up a restaurant. There already was 4 or 5 restaurants there, because there was these 2 cemeteries were within half a mile of these restaurants. And I remember very well of the restaurants. I was born upstairs over this one restaurant. But in a couple of years, my dad decided he wanted his own building, so he built a great big building that was closer yet to the cemeteries. And there's a big cement block building. They had a saloon in the front. And then part way back was a dining room started. And the dining room was a big one. It ran clear from the street to the alley and the kitchen in the back. And I remember we could feed up to 200 people in that dining room. And they run that for years. And that's where my brothers and sisters, some of them were born there at that time. My dad wrote letters back home in Ireland, and he told his folks to pack up and come over to America. So they all come over. He had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and they finally come over here. And I remember one of his sisters' name was Margaret. They called her Maggie. Well, Maggie used to work for him in his restaurant, and it wasn't long. In a couple of years, she finally met a man by the name of Joe LeBeau. So she finally married Joe LeBeau, and Joe LeBeau, later on, he also had a restaurant down the street from our restaurant. There was 5 restaurants in one block at the foot of this were these 2 cemeteries. And in them days, people come to the funerals. They didn't have the hearses with the motored hearses like now. It was all drawn by horses and carriages. The people would ride in carriages, and they'd come out to the cemeteries that way. And after the funerals, they'd all come down to these restaurants. And the deal was, nobody knew how much stuff to cook. They all cooked so much food. They had corned beef and cabbage and so forth, and they all were together. There were nobody fighting one another about business. They all had to play ball together. So what happened, sometimes they'd all be going mostly over to other restaurants, and if they did, they wouldn't have enough food. So what they did, they'd go out the back door and come over to the other restaurants and get food enough to feed the extra people they had, and vice versa. That's the way they went in business, and they never were any of them having any trouble. They all got along very well. The name of all the restaurants were, besides my folks' restaurant, was Cunningham, was across the street, and next to our family restaurant was a party named Sullivan, and then down the street there was O'Malley, and then across the street there was Murphy, and then there was Joe LeBeau, which was my father's brother-in-law. Everything run pretty smooth along that times. And then finally, one Sunday, my dad always liked to hunt. He never did. They wouldn't allow him to have a gun in Ireland. So he had everything he wanted after he had lived over here. So finally, one Sunday morning, he left our restaurant with his bird dog and a shotgun. And out west of where we lived, there was a big, lot of swampy ground with a lot of jack snipes, birds, and wild ducks and so forth. So he used to go out there on a Sunday and try his luck, and he'd get a lot of these snipes. He shot quite a few of them. And this Sunday morning, he was walking down the street, and his dog was running ahead of him, and the dog happened to run up by the front of a doorway of a place down the street, about a couple blocks, and as a guy jumped out in front of the dog, and he kicked the dog, and my dad said, "You kick that dog again, I'll kill you." He was madder than hell. It was just about as bad kicking one of his dogs as somebody would have kicked one of his children. So the guy took another kick at the dog, and my dad shot him. Then my dad said, "For crying out loud, what do I do?" So he turned around and he walks on back home to his restaurant, and they called the police. And the police asked him what happened, and he told them what happened about this guy coming out, and he kicked the dog, and he said, "If you kick my dog again, I'll kill you." And he said, "That's just what I did." So they said, "Well, we won't lock you up, but there's going to have to be a hearing." So at the hearing, when they had it, they had this guy's wife that my dad shot. She was there, and they had court there, and they asked him what happened. He told what happened, and finally after he got done, they finally called her on the witness stand, and they asked her, what did she think of the deal of this guy shooting her husband? She says, "I want to tell you," she says, "my husband was a drunkard. He'd come home drunk, and he would just kick me and slap me all over the house. He'd done me a favor for shooting my husband." He says, "I don't blame him a bit." So anyway, they let my dad go. He never was prosecuted after that. That was the end of that hunting day, too. Right after that, one day, a party come into my father's saloon, and they asked if they knew of anyone that was a good swimmer. And he says, "Why?" Well, he said, "There's a party just drowned out about 3 miles south on Kedzie Avenue at the Clay Hole." The Clay Hole was a place where the Illinois Brick Company that made bricks got their clay to make brick out of. Anyway, this place was about 90 foot deep, and it was just like a well, but it covered about 50 acres, and it was full of water about 90 foot deep. And the party had drowned it in there, and they didn't know what, they wanted to get him out. So they asked my dad if he would go out and see if he could bring the body up. So he went out there, and he dived in that clay hole about 3 times. Anyway, the 3rd time he brought the body up, and of course the body had been dead for 4 or 5 hours by that time. But anyway, it was so deep where he dived in there that it was hard on one of his ears. He got hard hearing in one of his ears. And by this time, I had 11 brothers and sisters older than I am. And this time, when I was born, this was the year 1903. So I made number 12 in that family at that time. Upstairs, over this saloon and restaurant that my folks had, we had about 20 bedrooms, lots of room. We also had a lot of boarders, people that worked in the cemetery that boarded there and stayed there all the time. And there was always something going on at Flynn's place. The oldest one was named Grace. She was born in 1886. And then after Grace, there comes James, and he was born in 88. Then there was Tessie. Tessie was born in 89. Then Eva was born in 1890. Then there's Mary Marcella in 1891. Margaret in 92. Then there was John in 1894, Daniel in 1895, Joanne 1896, Catherine 98. Then there was Agnes Margaret 1900. Then there was Art in 1903. At that time, this place of business where my folks had was only about 2 blocks from the entrance to 2 different cemeteries. There was Mount Greenwood on the left and Mount Olivet on the right. And I remember in the summer when I was small, 4 or 5 years old, Molly used to take all of us kids, and we used to go up in the hot summertime, and we'd go up in the cemetery, and there used to be a place across the street where they sold brick ice cream. So she'd go in there and get one of the big brick ice cream. We had a bunch of spoons and stuff we took along with us from the restaurant and plates, and we'd go over in the cemetery, and nice and cool over there. These great big marble slabs over graves we'd sit around on the edge of them and use it like a table, and we would eat our ice cream, and after that we'd walk around the cemetery. They had a lot of big monuments, some big statues, and great big grave walls. They had some grave walls there that there was some priest by the name of Father McDonald. After he died, he had it built while he was alive, but you could look in a big glass door and you could look back in this big wall, and it looked just like an altar in the church back in the end of this thing. Was about 25 foot long, and on each side was marble doors where the caskets were. It would hold about 16 caskets in there, but you couldn't see the caskets, only the marble slabs that covered them up on the side and the big brass handles on the marble slabs. But that's what we used to do in the hot summertime, was walk around that cemetery. It used to be just like a wonderful park with all these big trees and stuff in it, and that's where we played most of the time, is going through the cemetery. We also had a cottage right back of this restaurant and property we had there across the alley, and that's where we had a big house there, a cottage we called it, and I remember we could use that too besides upstairs in our house, and we had a cook and them. They used to live in this cottage. They lived there, just made it their home. And out behind that was mostly all open country. And in them days, they had coursing matches. A coursing match is where they had the place about 20 acres out there, and they had it fenced off with woven wire. And ever so far, they had a hole in the woven wire along the edge, a escape hole, we call that. And I remember that time they used to ship rabbits and jackrabbits from Kansas and places, and they used to have, on Sundays, they'd go over there and they have a whole bunch of cages of rabbits. And my dad had about 12 dogs of his own that used to keep back of the restaurant in the shed back there, and we used to take them out through this coursing match. But what they did, they'd go out there and they'd have all these greyhounds, and they'd hold them back, they had leashes on them, and they'd turn the rabbit loose. Of course, the dogs get all excited, and they'd take off and start chasing this rabbit. A lot of times the rabbit, if you were, we give them they give them a long distance to take off, but the dogs knew they were out there, and they were ready to chase them, and the rabbits were kind of they figure something's going to happen. So they'd start running, and we'd turn the dogs loose, and they were chasing these rabbits. And of course, once in a while, a rabbit would run closer to the fence. He had a place to escape. He could get away. If he got away, it was better luck to him. He was on his own then. But I remember going out there, and there'd probably be hundreds of people out there to watch this here coursing match. As time went on, people were talking about a big land opening in Oklahoma, and also at the same time, they had a big land opening in South Dakota where you could draw a claim and win 160 acres of land. So my father thought, well, he says, I like to hunt, so I think I'll go out there, take the train out, and see what I can do about winning some of that land. So anyway, she talked it over to my mother, and she says, well, that'll be a good vacation. Why not go out and see what you can do? So he went out there, and he finally won a claim. He come back from South Dakota to Chicago and told my mother, well, I've won this land now. I'm going to have to do something about homesteading on that and have to put so much time in on it. So anyway, she said, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I'll get Anthony and my sister Maggie, and there's enough of them, they can take over and run this place while I go out there for a couple of years and back and forth. And that's what he did. He got Anthony to run his saloon there while he was to move from Mount Greenwood to South Dakota, to the homestead site at Gregory, South Dakota is where it was. And this homestead he won joined on the edge of the outskirts of the town. It was only about a half a mile from our gate post into the main part of town. The town finally developed. There's about 1,500 people in this town when we all were settled down out there. Sure, and so they were, you see in the paper where they were opening up land. There's going to have an opening in Oklahoma at that time, and about the same time there's having a land drawing, what they call a land drawing, where you could draw claims, which the claim was 160 acres of land if you want it. So he got thinking, well, he said, I've got these boys, they're all getting bigger now, and I think what I'll do, I like to hunt, and I'm going on out. I think I'll go to South Dakota, he said. So he goes out there as he's opening up this land drawing, and finally he rode on a train clear out to Fairfax, South Dakota, and there's where they had the land drawing for this land at Gregory County. And so he was out there, and they had the drawing, and he won a piece of land, and his piece of land was right up against a town site, you know, where a town was going to be built. It was all prairie out there at the time they drew the land, and there was no railroad from Fairfax clear to Gregory. It was about 30-some or 40 miles. That time they had to go by stagecoach. The railroad wasn't built up through there yet. It took a few years later before the railroad ever got there. But he won this piece of land, and he comes down back to Chicago and told my mother, he says, I want a piece of land out there. So he says, I think we'll keep our restaurant, we'll have it here, and I'll have my, he had brothers and that run it. And he said, I think I'll go out. He says, you can run the restaurant, you can either ride a train back and forth if you want to go. And so anyway, we kept that restaurant going. So out west we got ready, and I remember they, from the railroad company in them days, for so much money, you could rent a railroad car, that you could take all your furniture, machinery, anything. You can even take 2 or 3 head of cattle in that car. You know, that's what most of the pioneer people that drew claims did. They'd rent a railroad boxcar and take all their belongings and go out to a town, and then some of them have teams of horses and wagons and everything in that railroad car, and some furniture enough to get by on, and get to these towns where they would unload it and go on out and stake a tent or build up a shack, something to live in, because they had on this land, if you wanted, you had to put in so many months a year time living on it, and you also had to plow up so many acres, maybe 10 acres of land. You'd have to have a break and plow that up, and of course you'd have a garden and so forth, but that's what it was at that time. So finally, anyway, we were getting ready to go.
Dad goes and has them both recorded, the one he won west of Gregory and the one that he won 4 miles east of Gregory. But he found out afterwards that this party had sold him that piece of land, also sold that homestead drawing to another fellow for $800. But my dad had recorded his first, so it was his. So the other fellow lost, but he put down for that piece of land. Well, anyway, he got the next train going back to Chicago, and he goes back and he tells Ma about him winning the land and also buying a piece of land, and he says, we can now start getting ready, he says, and get things together, so when I get part of this house built out there, we can all make it out there, and that will be a good place to raise a family as large as ours, because at that time we had several children. There was about, at that time, 7 of us, at least 7 or 8. And then later there was more. But there was more before the 7 or 8. But from beginning to the end, there was 15 of his children. But of all the 15, there was only 9 of us that pulled through to come out of it. went on. He gets back to the Dakotas. And by the time that he returned, the railroad had went from Fairfax up as far as Bonesteel. Then at Bonesteel was the end of the line. And at that time, it was still 30 miles on across country to Gregory. So at that time, he bought a couple loads of lumber, and he hired a fellow to haul him up a freighter. And this freighter hauled him and my dad, and all his equipment, his camp and tents and stuff up to Gregory. And my dad rode into Gregory on the first load of lumber that ever went in there. So that was the starting of the building. So he sets up his tents, and there he went on. They hired some help, and they built one big room, which we later on moved into. But in the meantime, my mother was back in Chicago, gathering everything together to make the move to the Dakotas, and at the same time, she rented our place of business there to my father's brother, whose name was Anthony. And Anthony run that place while we went west. So my mother finally gets this big immigrant car loaded with everything. And in them days, these immigrant cars, you could put anything in it, a cow or a horse or anything you wanted to take along. So they loaded that thing with household goods, everything that they figured they need and could use, and also a lot of odds and ends, and hell, they even had an Irish jaunting cart, a one-horse, two-wheel cart. And besides that, had railroad jacks, track jacks, everything that you need to jack, building up or move it or whatever you wanted to do with it. So anyway, on this train, she finally makes it with all these children, and they take off for the Dakotas. And as she arrived in Bonesteel, I think it was late in the afternoon, that as far as the train went. So we all stayed overnight in Bonesteel that night. So early the next morning, we hired a fellow by the name of Culp. He run the stagecoach, one of them, that went up to Gregory. And that was about 30 miles away. So anyway, there was enough of us to fill up the stagecoach, and we also had several dogs. And we didn't know what we were going to do with that, and Mr. Culp says, just tie one of them on the back axle and let him run along, and these other dogs all follow as we went up the road. He said, there won't be no charge for the greyhounds because I'm not carrying them. They're just tied on. So on our way, we went across country, and there was towns there such as St. Charles was a little town, about 10 miles from Bonesteel. Another one was Herrick, another 10 miles. And then there was a Burke, another few miles along the line. And then we finally got to Gregory late at night, and that's where we unloaded. And we had these tents set up, a couple tents in this one big room that we all could cook in. And this cabin that was built also had a big attic in it that most of us slept up there, the kids, and then my brothers just slept in these tents outside. And we had just a big cook stove, a big cook range in there, and they cooked on. And I remember my mother telling about one time there was a hell of an electrical storm come up and lightning, and all they had was a tin pipe, going off the roof, Here's lightning like the devil, and she was afraid the shack was going to be blown down. It's so strong out in that open country. But anyway, we went through that storm and on to everything. And as time went on, we kept adding on to this one big room, and we had several rooms. We also had several houses all into one, under one big roof. We had plenty of room for everything that we owned. We had a friend by the name of Watson. He was a sign painter, and he used to stay with us there, and he painted signs for all these saloons and buildings that were being built on Main Street. And I remember he painted a sign, and we put it over the front of our house, such a big house, and we called this sign said on it, Rose Lawn Farm. The front yard was full of wild roses. See, it was all sod yet and prairie. But later on, we plowed everything up just like everybody else did. This house had 8 rooms in it after we were done building, and one big, large 2-room house behind that we used for our wash house and for storage. Also had a big coal bin and on the back of this 8-room house, all glassed in. dad also bought another farm a mile south of the one we lived in, west of Gregory. And on that farm there was a shack, so he moves that off over to where the others. We had several buildings around this homestead. By the time we got done building, and it was quite a setup. So anyway, my grandfather finally, he came out from Chicago. He was way up around 85 to 90 years old, and when they had this land drawing for the next county up from ours, which they called Tripp County, my dad took him over to the land office and had him draw a number, and he also drew a claim, which was out by a great big lake. The lake was a couple miles long, and they call the lake Dog-Ear Lake, and this lake is 15 miles south of Winter, South Dakota. And so that's where my grandfather, he homesteaded that, and one of my brothers used to stay with him part-time, and my sister Molly used to go out there too and stay and cook, and he proved up on that. So that's another farm. This farm, he bought it off of a party named Boyles, and after he bought it, I remember when I used to go over there and was looking at this farm, they were plowing it up with raking plows, hand plows. You know, 4 head of horses on a plow, and they had 2 of them going to plow that up. Also, next farm to that, there's a party by the name of Grant that had a great big steamer. And this steamer was a big, they call it an Avery. It's run with burn coal and steam, just like, looked like a railroad locomotive. Well, anyway, they pulled 12 plows with this big steamer, and 12 furrows at a time was plowed. But they could only plow in certain kind of weather. It couldn't be too wet or the wheels would be slipping, and if it was too dry, the ground was too hard to pull all in. So that was the only trouble about plowing with the big steamer. But I remember they plowed it all up before they put the fences up, because it took so far to turn around to go back to cut the next furrow going the other way. We owned about 30-some head of horses, and we used to drive them back and forth to pasture on the west side of Gregory from this farm where we homesteaded to the one we bought at Boyles where they were plowing up. We had a pasture over there. And every morning we'd take them back one way or we'd bring them back another. And I can remember going across these railroad tracks with this herd of cattle and horses. But later on in the falls when we had feed, we just keep them at home, and we had feed racks and big barns. In the winter come on, we had all this hay and stuff in there. And they used to also cut hay at Dog-Ear Lake, which was about 20-some miles out there. They'd go out there every fall with tents, and they would cut a lot of hay, and that's all they had to do, you know, is just cut hay, and then when they had time, they would haul, go out with a couple hay racks, a couple 4-headed teams, and they'd go out there one day, and then they'd stay overnight, load up the next day and hunt around, and then probably another day later, the weather looked good, they'd take off back for Gregory with 2 big loads of hay, sometimes more. They can only haul in the hay. They could do a lot of hunting while they were out there, and they could be hunting on the way out and the way back. They always carried rifles and shotguns and had dogs with them. One time they were telling me that they were out right south of Globe, cutting across the prairie, and up jumped a jackrabbit, and they had one little greyhound. They used to call it a whippet. It was a smaller hound, but it was a fast runner. And this dog run this rabbit to run out in a big circle and turn around and keep running and bring that rabbit right back fairly close, you know, or she figured they may take a shot and get it, but every time they come in, this rabbit would make another circle and she'd make another one. They kept that up for about a half hour, and then finally she got this rabbit on the way back, and as she was chasing this rabbit, they were driving down the road. They never stopped, they just kept on going, and she'd keep bringing them on and keep running them, and finally up jumps another rabbit, and she gets confused between the 2 rabbits. The one made a dive and got away, and she started running after a new one, a different rabbit. And hell, she ran and ran, and she caught that rabbit. But after she caught that rabbit, she just laid down, and they put her in the hay rack, and about an hour later, she died. So that was the end of that dog. There's one less third of feet. Well, anyway, talking about dogs, my dad had about a dozen of them around, and every time one of these old-fashioned cars, like a 2-cylinder Buick, get them chugging down the road, these dogs would all take off and start chasing these cars and barking, you know, and my dad used to holler, he says, "Whistle, Art, whistle." He couldn't whistle, he'd just go, he couldn't whistle, and I'd get laughing, and I couldn't whistle either. But I'd laugh at the damn dogs that were running, you know. They could run faster than the cars were going, and it was kind of comical to watch them going. And that was quite a deal when to watch them going. These greyhounds and trailhounds and all the yelling. The guy in the car didn't know what the hell to think. And these dogs are yipping and yipping, and as they went by. Every time my dad would get ready to go hunting, he had a police whistle. He used to come out and he'd blow it. And the dogs, you know, the dogs would all come running. And about that time, he'd start grabbing this dog and that one, and they'd lock him up in a big granary. He'd lock them all up with the ones he wanted to take. Of course, he had a favorite. He figured it was better. He had a trail hound and another one that he wanted to take with him. But these other dogs finally got wise to him. He used to come out of the house with a shotgun and blow the whistle, and when he did, these damn dogs, most of them done the disappearing act. They'd all run and hide. And later on, as he'd get away from the house, about a mile, he'd happen to hear something behind him and look behind, and here's all these dogs that were following him. They knew just what to do to go hunting. These Canaries, these Indians that live down in the Ponca Creek, they always like Pop pretty well, and of course, they all like him. If you want people to like you, just be on the giving end of it, you know. He always had plenty of whiskey to drink, and they weren't allowed to sell whiskey to Indians in the saloons in them days, so he really had a lot of friends, these Indians, and he used to tell them, anytime you want to go hunting, Mr. Flynn, he says, you just let us know, and we'll send in a buggy and a team, and we'll get you, and you can stay out there with us and do your hunting. So he'd always have 3-4 bottles of whiskey, you know, and he'd tell them, well, I'll go out next week, and they'd stop on that day, and they'd be waiting, so he'd give this Phil Canora, he was quite a guy, he would come in, you know, and stop, and I'd give him 2 or 3 drinks, and he said, well, they'd load up the shotguns and a couple of these trail hounds, and they'd take off. It was about 8 miles southeast of Gregory. Stop, and I'd give him 2 or 3 drinks, and he said, well, they'd load up the shotguns and a couple of these trail hounds, and they'd take off. It was about 8 miles southeast of Gregory on the Ponca Creek. And there used to be a lot of these cottontail rabbits out there, and he used to go out there and he'd bring in 25 to 35 of them at once. But the way he'd do, he'd clean them all. It was late in the fall and winter. He'd fill them full of hay. Gut them and then put hay in them. Just leave the skin on them. He was ready to eat them. But they're the best eating of all the wild game, I think. So that was a difference in what we had to eat besides pork or beef. We always liked the cottontails the best. And he used to like to hunt these doves, these wild doves. He'd make a kind of a dumpling, dumplings, you know, like you would with chickens and dumplings out of them. But I never did like the taste of them because they always had a funny smell. It smelled like a wet diaper, this bacon powder or whatever they used in them. But I couldn't eat that. But he would eat it. And we also, on our big barns, he was crazy about eating these young pigeons. And he had pigeon boxes nailed all over the front of this big granary. And I can remember at just about sundown, that ridge row in that granary was about 50 to 60 foot long, was just loaded that whole roof with pigeons. They'd roost there at night. Then the next day they'd take off and fly all around the different neighboring country and feed, and then they'd be back again the next night and roost again. Then other times he had his spring wagon, his team of horses, and he used to get a big jug of water and take a little grub, and he used to go down to Silver's on the Missouri River and Keighley's down on the river. And these Keighley's, and then they just probably have a small cornfield on the river bottom. And all they mostly had was big family Keighley and Silver's, and that's how he met them. And they used to cook out of old 10-gallon buckets and stuff. And of course my dad had a lot of Western supply kettles and stuff, and he used to take them out there, you know, and he set them up in cooking equipment. And he'd come in with a lot of game from there. One time he come back, and I says, where's Pooey? There was a trail hound. He says, when I got ready to come home, Pooey, he must have been chasing a rabbit down the line somewhere in the woods, and he didn't show up, so he said, hell, it was getting late in the morning, and I wanted to make it home. Had all these rabbits that had killed, and get home, and so he says he figured he'd make it. So he took off. I was over 20-some mile out there, you know. And, hell, about an hour after he was home, we got the horse unhitched and everything put away. Here, this damn dog come running up, you know. All the way in from the Missouri River. He found his way back. You couldn't lose one of them then. farm of ours put me in mind of the Grand Central Station. These people, he'd go out and hunt out there, and they'd come in, different times, and they'd stay overnight. It was just like a hotel with them, and they were just exchanging, stay in one place, stay in the other, and so forth. And hell, as I remember, that went on for years. And that's where we met the Langans. He hunted and went out there, and they would come in, and I met the kids, and they used to come in when we'd thrash, and they'd help us thrash Johnny Wood, and I'd go back out there and help them. And that's what we do, at exchange help, and they did quite a place out there, too. I could write a book on that one. But I wrote for this part. At the same time, my dad had a saloon on Main Street in Gregory. Later on, there's an oil company at this date. There's a Farmers Union oil station there on the corner. He owned a couple lots, and he had that saloon running there in the early days. And at the time, they had the land drawing in Tripp County. He had that saloon there. And there was no churches built yet in town, and I remember on Sundays, he used to close the saloon up, and they'd come down there, and they'd have mass in that church. They'd pile up a bunch of whiskey cases like an altar, and then they'd put on a cloth over it, and put these candle holders and so forth up, and they'd have church in this saloon. They didn't have no churches yet. And also, he used to do so damn much hunting at Dogger Lake. In the fall, just before they'd have Thanksgiving, they're finally getting enough money together to build a church. Everybody was pitching in, and a little here and a little money there. And he used to go out to Dogger Lake. One year there, he shot enough wild ducks, mallards, and ducks of all kinds, and brought them back. He used to take the guts out of them and just put hay in them until we get them home, and then pick them, And I remember he furnished them with enough wild ducks to feed that whole Catholic bazaar when they had it. He wasn't satisfied with the saloon that he had in Gregory and the one in Chicago his brother's running, so he goes out way out west in Tripp County over into a place they call Whitten, South Dakota. And he had a saloon out there, and that was around 60 miles from Gregory, out north and a little west. And John used to, they had big teams, 4 head of horses, or 6 even sometimes, on these wagons, and they'd have big freight wagons that they'd haul all this beer and whiskey and stuff like that out to this saloon. He used to be a freighter. He was about 15 years old. He was the youngest of all the freighters. All the others were men, grown men. But he used to have that, but he always had plenty of help. He'd get stuck on the road. They never had no highways or nothing. They just take off across country up by Hamel, South Dakota even. They picked a place where the going was good. There were several different routes going out to these towns. But anyway, he would stop probably out to Hamel overnight. That was about a 30-mile run, at least. And they'd sleep out there, and then he'd go on to Whitten, and then unload, and then come on back. And I remember, there'd be 2 days going, a couple days coming. And I remember when I was a kid that when he'd come back, he used to go out in this cabin behind me, had a big stove, and take a bath, and because everybody was lousy in them days from stopping in these damn 2-bit hotels where they'd stop, take a good bath and get clean clothes on again before he'd even, that was the first thing he did when he'd arrive at our place. And I remember one time, my dad was running that saloon in Whitten, the United States Marshal come along, and he was checking these Indians over and that. And in them days, it was again allowed to sell an Indian a drink. But hell, there was 3/4 Indians and about a 1/4 whites out there. And he come in there, and there was about 3 big Indians laying against the wall, on the south wall. And he says, Mr. Flynn, he says, it's again the law to give them Indians a drink. He says, I know that. I wouldn't give them a drink if their damn tongue was hanging out of yard. You notice he said give, but if he didn't sell it to these Indians, he never would have had any business. So he sold plenty of it. And one night he heard a lot of banging on a door, and he went down and he opened it up. And here it was, this Phil Canary, and he had a 30 Marlin rifle. And he says, Flynn, he says, I've got a bit moving again. He says, I'm going to give you this gun. I don't want to be caught with it. He says, they just shot Sully. He says, the United States Army government men killed him. And he said, they would kill me too if he says that I've been riding all night and all day and night again. He was hiding around it in Bill Creek, and he stopped there and had something to eat. And I remember he getting a little food with him. He took it with him, and he took another horse after leaving the gun, and he headed out there to towards Pine Ridge or Wounded Knee somewhere where these Indians all claim they have cousins. You know, all Indians are cousins. They say that. Well, I also met an Indian out around Whitman. He's lived between Winter and Carter, this Indian did. And he had a lot of horses, but these horses the government used to give them to the Indians, and they put a mark on them, a big ID branded on them. And these Indians weren't supposed to sell them, but we had a couple of them. We had one. We called the horse Red Hill, after the Indian's name. His name was Red Hill. So I can remember one of these horses, he was an outlaw, never was broke. It was a big gray horse, and I remember on a Sunday, my dad told my brothers to put the harness on him and break him. So anyway, they had him out there this Sunday morning and out by the barn, and they had about 6 foot of rope between the horse and this post. They had the horse tied up to this post, and they were trying to get harness on this horse. And every time they throw it on the horse's back, the horse would kick it all to pieces, kick it over a barn, or kick it out of sight. And he looked out the window and he saw what was going on. And he says, they've got that horse scared to death. He said, I'm going out and show them how to put that harness on that horse. So he went down there and he says, just a minute. He says, you guys, when you throw that harness up on that horse, he thinks you're whipping him. So he said, I'll show you how to do it. So he walks up and between this horse and the post and goes to pet him, and he reached out and he touched him on the end of the nose, and the horse pulled back. And my dad was between this horse and the post. And this horse just put all his damn weight on his front hoof right on top of Dad's foot. And backed up and took pull, and he had a big bunion there anyway. And it made him so damn mad that he took a punch at the horse. And he finally let go then, and he limped up to the house. And that was the end of a perfect day for him. That was the end of showing somebody how to put harness on a horse. Jim, my oldest brother, he had a job working for Stanford and Slaughter uptown at this time, and he was their stenographer. He made out all these land, contracts and so forth. And he was the only guy in town that had an automobile. He had a little red Maxwell, a 2-cylinder, one that, like the one Jack Benny always talk about, his red Maxwell. There was one like that, and I remember he lived on the east side of Gregory, and he used to run that around. It was a 2-cylinder, and Bess was with him one Sunday, and no windshield at all on it, and it was a right-hand drive, and it had a shifting gear on the right side. You push ahead to go ahead, and you pull back to back up, and they had a middle, this lever's a big brass lever in there, and also had a brake handle. So this Sunday, Bess was with them, and she had on a great big hat, and Jim was driving around the town with her, and he pulled right on up in front of their house, and everybody, of course, in them days were looking out, It was like if somebody would land with a helicopter by a house today, but at that time, they pulled up there, and everybody's looking out, and as he went to stop, he pulled the lever back, and Bess started to stand up. And as she started to stand up, he pulls his lever back, and the damn thing jumps backwards right out from under her. So she fell right over the front of the car, over the headlight on the ground, and that was that for the car driving around. But I remember he had this real estate office, and he used to, on the side, he would trade for different things, such as, he had cars, and he even sold his red car to John Horst later on. I heard about that. And then he traded cars. He had a big car called the Thomas Flyer. It was a great big one, a big touring car. It had a big Klaxon horn on it, and it had tires on it, high as wagon wheels. And I remember that car real well. He had that, and he traded it to a guy down by Blacksburg, Nebraska, that had a steamer for running flash machines and for plowing. And Jim used to have these pictures of these big tractors and steamers and separators and plows hanging around the real estate office. But I'd laugh, he traded this old car for that steamer outfit. And I remember this one day we saw a big tractor coming right up the road, and they drove right up to our yard, and they said, where do you want us to leave this before we pull the fire? And they fired it up with coal, and they just had enough coal to get it up there. I remember when I come home from school, I stood out there right on the north side of my house. So, anyway, I looked it over and I thought, boy, that was quite a thing, because I'd already saw a big tractor full of plows. But the joke of it was, this damn tractor, these plows didn't even belong to this tractor. These plows were made for a hell of a lot bigger outfit than that. You had about 6 plows, and that damn thing I don't think could pull 3 at that time. But anyway, John and Dan, they were just big kids then, around 16 or 17, and so Sunday morning come along, and that was a day of rest, so they figured, it was rainy weather anyway, and they figured what they'd like to do. John was always interested in a little bit of steam engines, like he got one for Christmas one time, and bought it, and you had a little alcohol lamp running to make steam and run a little, you see this little engine running. So he got it in his head, he could run it. He knew all about steam from that little toy. So they finally Sunday morning come around, and we went all over the barnyards and every place. There was nothing, and we fired it up. Old fence posts, anything that would burn, we fired that up. We didn't have any coal or corn cobs like that when we got it going. And I remember there'd been a lot of rainy weather, and it was early in the spring, and so we got it steamed up all right, and we got the water and everything, and so it didn't blow up, and we took off right down to the barnyard. We wanted to move it anyway from the north side of the house. They figured to put it down in the barnyard somewhere. So we drove it around the barn a few times, and they went around several times. The thing was working pretty good, out through the hog pastures and cow yard and that, and we were running it around. And finally, anyway, I found out that there was a whistle on the damn thing, so I started blowing this whistle. It was about 10:30 in the morning, and finally woke my dad up. He's up late Saturday night running a slow. He says, "What the hell's going on out there?" To my mother. She says, "Well, the boys are moving that steam engine." He said, "They are?" He says, "I didn't know they could run that." "Yeah." So they took off. He looked out the window, and geez, we were just driving around back of the barn, and we turned right around the corner in front of the barn. There's a big manure pile. So Dad says, "Let's just push that big pile of horse manure and stuff right on ahead." Well, what happened, he run right up there and start pushing, and when the big back wheel got over the middle of this manure pile, we got stuck right there. And it was right in front of the barn, there's a haymow door above it, and here I was blowing a whistle in all the excitement. I was only about 11 years old, and my dad looked out the window, and he saw this fire going out of the chimney in front of the post in there, and he says, "Them guys must be crazy." He says, "They're going to burn that damn barn down." And hell, that wheel was just turning around and around, slipping through this manure, and we had to stop it, and then they tied our chain down a post or something that got out of there. But he come down there and he says, "Jesus Christ," he says, "we won't have no fence post or nothing else by the time you guys get done." Well, they were all just old wood and stuff. But I remember that, and then we drove it over and backed it up alongside of another barn and let her cool off, and that was the big steamer. But out of that, another time I come home from school, and my brother's always trading for something, and he had a picture of a big Jack breeding mule on the wall in his real estate office, and he says, that's what we ought to have on the farm. So anyway, he met some guy, said he had a big Jack, just like that one. He says, "That's where he got the picture." He said, "That's the Jack right there. I'll trade it to you for something." I don't know what he traded for, but he got this Jack. Well, I remember I come home from school, and this party had come and brought this mule, but you ought to see it. I says to Mom, I says, "Where did you get that little colt out there?" And she says, "Well, that's," a fellow told me, he says, "that belongs to your brother Jim. He traded for it, and that was a Jack." I says, "A Jack? Hell, that's that ain't much bigger than a big Jack rabbit." That great big, he was living in Prospector Burrows is what it was. So I went out there and just to look at him, and he looked around, he was just as gentle as could be, and put my hand on him. I noticed he didn't bother, nothing bothered him, so I leaned over his shoulder, and he didn't care, and I got on him. So I found out I could ride him, so I untied him and took a ride. Went up on the west end of our farm with him just for a ride, trying him out. And anyway, as Jim finally come home, he said, the guy stopped. He says, "Where's the mule at?" He said, "He just run over." He says, "Art's riding me." "Art's riding me." He says, "Well, that mule will tell him, that great big mule." She says, "It ain't a big mule. He's right down there back of the barn now, coming around the corner." And so I come around the corner, and Jim said, "Oh, no," he said, like that. "Gee whiz, that guy pulled a fast one on me." So anyway, why, he says, "Well, I think as long as Art's got him, I might as well just give him to Art, because nobody will ever want him." But I remember that mule, we had him around there for 4 or 5 years, and I remember my dad says, "Well," he says, "you got that Jack?" He says, "Maybe you'll get a mule, breed that mule to old Dolly, and you may get a good work mule out of him." So I remember he told Dan and John to take that Dolly and beat her, and they did. And a while later on, right here one day, we went down the barn, and here, this old Dolly was a great big horse, and here she had a little mule colt that couldn't even hardly reach up to suck. She'd have to kind of squat while he was sucking. But that was the Jack. Well, at the same time, this Jack we were farming the East Farm. John and Dan were. Even Vern West used to stay with them. They had 2 tents. One they'd sleep in. They had a couple of beds in one, and they'd cook in the other one. And they had a bunch of beer cases they used to put the food in, because if they didn't, the dog could tear the lid off anything else. And that's where they put their bacon and eggs and all their food. But anyway, this one day my mother says, well, I had a homemade cart that I used to, with a pair of shafts and a buggy axle and wheels. And I finally got a hold of one of them big bread boxes like they used to ship bread out of town by railroad from town to town from these bakeries. It's a big one, and they just fit it in between the shafts on this axle, and I fastened that on there. And that had a big lid on the top. So this big lid, you could open it and drop it clear back, and put all these, anything in there to haul. That's what I had at first, to go out so I could haul junk in. And so my mother says, well, she says, why don't you and Margaret, John and Dan been out there a week now on that East Farm across from Hutchison's farm. Why don't you go on out there and take this groceries out there to John and Dan and them? Because they'll need it by now. So anyway, I said, okay. I thought, geez, we're just another freighters. We could do that. So Margaret and I, we had all the stuff loaded up, and we could go out one way by the depot and then ride straight east, and then that was one way. It wasn't any way, and then we'd come back another road. After we get out there, we could go and come back on the other road that was north by Tish's road, and out that other way, out Hendrickson, Hodgins, and on that road come in by Nunemaker on the north end of Gregory back in. That trip was about, I'd say about 10 mile trip out and back. We started out there, and that Jack was so damn slow, and if he saw a team of horses that had this old Jack, he would liven up. He'd step it right off, till he get up to them. And then we'd whip him on by and go on again. And pretty soon, he'd start slowing up again. He'd just move along like a turtle at times. So I said, we never get out there. I said, Margaret, you win her like a horse and maybe you'll get going. And once in a while, she'd make a noise like winning like a horse, and geez, he'd step right along there. But pretty soon, I think he got wise to that, because he'd start slowing down. Well, I had this buggy whip made out of a willow, and I used to slap him over the rear end, but that didn't seem to bother do anything. Margaret said, give it to me, I'll make him go. Margaret's about 3 years older than I am, and she took this whip and she just jabbed him in the rear end, and geez, that made him mad, and he kicked with both feet. He come right down there unloading that basket and everything else, grabbing all. But we damn near kicked his car off of the thing, and so anyway, we cut that out. But we did get home, but it was a damn day's job just going 9 miles with him. But it was just doing something different, and that's how time kept going on. It didn't cost very much to live in them days, because we didn't have no electric light bills or water bills. We had kerosene lamps pump out in the back. All you had to do is work the pump handle and get your water, and outdoor toilets, no plumbing to go haywire, because we always had plenty of toilets, because every time Bob brought a building off to someplace that had an extra toilet, so we used to set them around back in the farm. We had 3 or 4 toilets down there around back of the barns, so we always had plenty of toilets. We had, like these people today have 3 bathrooms, we had 4 toilets on the farm. And I can remember I had an old check that was cashed back, and I think it was in 1912, and it was for taxes on the saloon building on Main Street in Gregory. And I remember that for 2 years, the taxes on that was $12. So things were different then. And the town well was right in the middle of Main Street, right in the intersection, right in the middle. They had 3 wells that I remembered. They had one there, and they had another one that was up in the middle of the street, where later on in the years they put a flagpole down in there. That was up in the main park of the block, where all the banks and the post offices today is getting going to one another. And then on the side street, where there was one alongside of the Petinoffs. We had 2 Petinoffs, the Gregory Times Advocate and the Democrat. And we used to take the Advocate, and we get that every Thursday. That cost about $1.75 for a year at that time. We also subscribed to the Omaha World Herald, and that was the time that Will Rogers used to have a section in that paper, and that was the first thing my mother would always read, is Will Rogers, these different sayings. We're pretty witty in knowing what he had to say every day. I'll never forget the year that they built themselves a potato planter out of an old corn planter. They put a seat back of each wheel on it, and they had a box ahead of us. We'd sit down and we could pull these potatoes out and we plant them. Marty sitting one side and me on the other. And we planted around 7 acres of them damn potatoes. And I can remember us going along and Marty says, "I'll show you how to plant a potato like this." And she would just rake them in there, And I'd laugh, later on. This stuff, they just look like a row of lettuce someplace where she do that, see. But she says, "Well, I'll show you how to get rid of the potatoes," and we did. But I remember we sold potatoes for around 25, 30 cents a bushel in them times. That's all we could get for them. And then we had to take it out and trade with the grocery stores where we sold them. They'd give us aluminum checks, some like quarter and 50 cents in a dollar size. And I remember we had about, maybe $100 of each from 2 stores, like the farmer's store on the corner, a guy named Wolf ran that, and another one, Woolheiser, ran another one up down south, and they used to buy some. We'd sell in enough that we'd get quite a few groceries, chips, and then we could take it out and trade as time went along. We had a real large basement underneath our houses. Oh, hell, I can't tell you exactly, but we had hundreds of bushels of potatoes that we put them down there, and towards spring, I remember they all got sprouting, and we were hauling them out and dumping them in the hog pens, and of course we had our seed potatoes to plant again, but we never did plant that much after that. And one year I remember they planted, about 7 acres of beans. They double loaded, had it. These are beans, and so when they all got ripe, of course we cultivated them all summer. When they were ripe and dried out in the fall, nobody wanted to pick them, but I pulled all them beans. And I remember at that time we'd thrash them out in a wagon box, roll them in a couple forks full, and beat them down, knock them out, and then throw the hulls off. But we had a lot of beans that year, and I remember they sold a lot of them for about 6 cents a pound. We had all the beans we wanted, and we used to butcher real early in the spring, and we didn't have no refrigeration then like now. The only refrigeration in town was behind the saloons. They had a big ice house and that. But we didn't put up ice. We didn't have an ice house. But I can remember we used to make a lot of salt pork, and during the summer months, we had chicken fryers, and we had ducks and mostly chickens and so forth, and field corn, and we always had plenty to eat and to drink. On our farm, we had quite a few cattle, and in the spring these cows were having calves, some of them having trouble, and Babe used to be the veterinarian, and a lot of times she'd say, "Well, come on out and help me," and we get a wire stretch, and we were pulling calves, pigs, and everything else. But she was the main veterinarian, and she did all the milking mostly. She milked from 6, probably 7, 8, 10 cows at a time. But at that time, we always had all the butter we wanted. We never did sell any cream in them days. We just used it ourselves, what we had. And our hogs had all the extra milk and so forth. And I remember the old cream separator. We had one that was a big setter. You poured it all in, leave it in overnight. And the next morning, you had a glass on the side. You could see how much cream was on top of all this milk. And we used to take all that cream off. And then the bottom we'd draw off we'd feed that to the hogs and the dogs and whatever wanted, chickens and all that. I also had another job every night after school. We'd come home, we had this big hog lot, and we'd feed them ear corn. And I used to, before they feed them every night, I'd go out there and rake all these corn cobs up, and they haul them up by tubfuls. I had a homemade cart, and I'd haul them up, and we had a big back porch like a coal shed back for a house, and we'd always put them in there. Kind of bad, stormy weather, we didn't have to go out to get anything like that. We had it inside, this coal house and this cob house. We had plenty of the tops. My mother had a big majestic range, and we burned cobs and that. She baked every week, and we made all her own bread she did, and so forth. And we had a real large table in our kitchen. We could feed as high as 20 if there were that many, but most certainly there never was less than 10, 12 people eating at a meal. And I can remember one time I was out to Dogger Lake, and we knew them Morgan fields that they homesteaded across from our place out there, where my grandfather homesteaded. They'd come in once in a great while. But anyway, we happened to be out there and we shot a bunch of them muskrats out of the lake. So we brought them home to skin them. The hides were worth about 80 cents a piece at that time. And I can remember Dave and I, we were cleaning them, skinning them. And my mother saw them, and I says, you know, these look just like cottontails. Well, she says, you know, in Chicago, they used to have them on some of them restaurants would serve them, and I said, they did? And she says, yeah. She said, they call them marsh rabbits back there. And she said, they eat them. So anyway, I said, well, what's wrong with, why not us try it? Look at how nice that meat looks. It looks just a little redder, though, than the cottontail. So she says, Babe says, well, why not we'll cook them? And I said, sure. I says, I'm not afraid of eating them. And so Babe and I was cleaning them, and I think we had about a dozen of them that we kept. And we cleaned them. And I remember I gutted them, you know, I cut the tails off and gutted them, and I cut the tail off of this one. I think I didn't cut it quite back in far enough. And anyway, John saw him, what are you going to do with them? And I said, well, we're going to cook them. He says, yeah, like hell. He says, I'm not going to eat any of them. And Ma says, you don't have to eat any of them. She says, we got these cottontails, all kinds of them out there. Gee, she says, so tomorrow, if he wants to, Babe and Mark wants to eat them, I'll cook them up. Morgan feels they were there, so we figured we just didn't say nothing to them about it. There was a couple of them, and there was about 15 of us at the table, and Ma told John, says, now, I'll put this rabbit right in front of you when we sit down, and you help yourself. See, and yeah, so anyway, we were all eating, you know, and I was eating these marsh rabbits, the muskrats, and they tasted just about something on the order of a cottontail. And so anyway, John was talking, yeah, while he's talking, why this plate of the rabbit got moved out, and geez, about the time he got done yakking, why he got one of these cars full of these with a couple of these muskrats on it. He took one, and he'd been eating there, and he laughing, talking, you know, and potatoes and gravy. And anyway, all in lunch, you know, geez, he jumps up on the table and he beats it. Never said a goddamn word. What was the matter with him? But after a while, he said, you know, he said, I come to this one. He said, you didn't cut that tail off. He said, I could tell what I was eating when I come to that. I said, you couldn't tell before, could you? Well, he says, you're cooking rats. The next thing you'll be cooking them snakes, too. I said, oh, hell. I said, they're all right. It's just your imagination. In October, they had some kind of a big celebration going on in Gregory there. And I remember they had stands on the street, you know, and selling hot dogs and different things. And they had a sideshow that was across the street from my dad's saloon. And these guys were in the sideshow. They had an opium guy smoking opium. And they even had a five-legged cow. And they had different pits in there with canvas, and they had these big snakes and armadillos and gilly monsters in one. This dope fiend was in the other smoking opium. And back in the end of it, they also had a five-legged cow, and this cow's leg come out of her shoulder and hung down her side over her front hip, shoulder. And I remember a hell of a big snow come up, and that was the end of that celebration. And these guys just sit around town for 8 or 10 days. And I remember the damn big snake. They had a big snake that was about 7 foot long, a diamond rattler, a Texas one. And I remember it died, so the guy gave it to me, and we took it home, and we skinned it, and we stuffed it. And I remember it stretched around front. We skinned it. It was about 7, 8 foot long. And we used to have it up against the wall on a board. And later on, we give it to my Uncle Johnny in Chicago. We sent it to him. And and then this show, they went broke there, and they were stranded there. And this tent was, about 24 foot wide, and it run clear back, about 45, 50 foot long. And I remember these guys were broke, and my dad bought it, the big tent, and they had these big boxes to put the canvas in, and I remember we brought them home, and the gilly monsters and all that stuff, we brought them home and put them in our basement. I remember one of the gilly monsters got out, and it disappeared. We never did find it. It got away. But later on, a couple years later, there was a guy out in another county. He wanted a big tent to put his horses in. So, Jesus, I guess my dad sold it to him. He took it out, and about a month later, he come back, and he said a hell of a big wind come up, and it just blows that tent to ribbons out there. They had some awful big winds out in that open country up there by Todd County in there. Between our house and Main Street in Gregory, the Indians used to come in from the north with their Indian wagons, and they'd pull up alongside of these lots on the side road, grass there, and they'd unhitch their horses and tie them up, stake them out, and then the old Indian would go up to Main Street, and the squaw would put the tent up herself. He wouldn't even wait. And then later on, they'd come back, they'd have a little campfire out on the ground and cook their supper. And I remember they'd always have a dog or two tied behind their wagons as they'd come in and go. One year, we had a well on the corner of our farm, and we had a gate over there that so we could get in and out of there. I remember I used to go over there and pump water. I used to look over there, go over there and pump water, and geez, I'd look over there, here's some Indian would be in there. Water's over some big old pot-bellied Indian, and he wouldn't even touch the pump handle, and it made me so damn mad. I used to run over there, and I told him, I said, if you want to water your horses here, it's all right, but get on the pump handle. I just got done pumping this for the cattle. So I said, don't ever stop here again unless you want to pump that handle. But I had a lot of time getting the water, and then they'd come along and drink it all up. So I tried to stop that. I can remember looking in there on the north side of town, and then north of our farm was a river went to Dallas. And going up the line, I remember you see a bunch of gypsies go by. We always kept our eye on them. Because just as soon as they, especially in the fall year when there's roasting years, they would, just as soon as they could get up there where that was, they'd be taken off into the cornfields and ramming off these roasting ears. And I remember Dad used to take off on horseback with a shotgun and run them the hell out of there and make them leave the sack right there. Tell them to get the hell out of there, blow their head off, And they took off and go out again. But we used to lose a lot of corn by them stopping too. One of the butcher shops had a slaughterhouse right north of our farm, and I can remember they used to butcher these cattle, and they'd throw all the guts right out on the ground. And I saw them Indians when I was a little kid pull over there. They stopped there, and they'd just after butchering, and they'd take them guts, and they'd start cutting the guts off, and they'd go down to the water troughs, and they used to cut them off in lengths and turn them inside out, and just wash them off in the trough. And then they'd go ahead and eat that raw, a lot of them, and send them, then they'd take the rest of it along with them. But that's the first thing they wanted when they butchered beef, even an Indian on the reservation. The first thing they ate was the guts, and the rest of the meat was all cut up in little slips and hung on lines to dry, and that was jerk beef. They'd dry that out, so they'd have something to eat, but they'd put salt on it and hang it out and dry it good to cure it. I remember we always had a phonograph to play on the farm anyway. We were all getting bigger. Jim County, he ran for an office, for a county office, to get an office in politics. And I remember a guy beat him, got in Charlie Oswald. Charlie beat Jim out of this office job, and Jim felt so damn bad, and he moved down to Gregory, and he went to Omaha. And this job would have paid about $80 or $90 a month, that job working in the county. But he went down there and he went into other businesses. He also had and we used to take turn about playing with me. Mom says, well, don't fight on it. None of the time play it. And I remember I used to get a roll, something like Fort Butterfly, It wasn't very long roll, but Marcus, just reminding that she grabbed this goddamn big roll was as round as a toilet paper, and she put that thing, and it took about a half hour to run that through. But the best part of it is that then, they were just starting to go to basket. And she met some kid, I guess he lived in winter. But anyway, he was invited down, and I remember that he got down and there, and of course he came over to our place, and Margaret met him, and we all had an introduction to this big slim kid, and I don't know what the hell his name is, but anyway, in the front room they go, and so anyway, he said, well, you've got to play a piano. And Margaret said, yeah, I'll play it for you. So anyway, she got on one of these kind of hot pieces, a pretty fast piece, which we were playing in them days, like Oh Johnny. And anyway, this guy sat down in the rocking chair. This damn rocker he was sitting in, we pushed it back. It was not too far from the corner, but one of the rockers just broke off of it. So anyway, we just set that back in the corner instead of out in the middle of the room. So anyway, she's playing this damn piece, he moves this, just kind of drags the rocking chair away from the wall, and he was sitting there, she was pumping it, and the thing was clanging away, and this kid got rocking, and he rocked back with his rocker was broke off, and Jesus, fire in the hell of a noise, and I looked in there, and the damn rocking chair rolled over backwards, and he rolled out the corner, and I never will forget that. He was so damn bashful, he didn't stay very long, he finally took off for town. Yeah, along about 4th of July was coming along, and I remember this one farm that
had a lot of corn planted on top. It had another pasture, but we didn't have no fences up. So anyway, we'd have to herd these cattle and watch them. And so on 4th of July, I remember they gave us 2 bits apiece. We each had our own riding horse. We all had our riding horses in that family. And I remember we each went uptown, and we were together. We rode up there, and we got ourselves 2 bits worth of jawbreakers apiece. They were big red ones, about as big as a quarter, and there was a few black ones, mixed different flavors, but they mostly taste like root beer. And I remember we took a couple gallons of water, and we'd go over to herd these cattle. We'd go all the day, over there. And I remember we'd have run a race to see who the hell could get rid of one of them the quickest of jawbreakers, sucking on them. And then the next time we'd shoot say, all right, let's see who can make one last the longest. So I remember, I said, okay. And of course, whoever lost would have to give the other one a jawbreaker, see? So I remember what she did. She got that damn jawbreaker in her mouth, but she put it between her teeth. She wasn't even sucking on it. So she beat me on that, see? And that kind of caught on. But that was our experience of having horses that sure was something them days with these horses. I can remember one time I had a little mare, and I put a saddle on her. I was going to go after these cattle across town, and I remember the damn cinch. I didn't have it, the cinch set up just quite right, and I remember that we just about got home, and I never did tighten the cinch tight on a horse. And this damn saddle, she kind of ran off the edge, and the saddle rolled right around her. Of course, I rolled off, and the horse did run away and finally kicked the saddle off, got it off, and I got home all right. One day while we were out in the yard, I was out there with my dad. We always had a big garden of potatoes right out in front of the house, big garden, and we were out there hoeing these potatoes and knocking potato bugs off the cans and so forth. And I remember this guy must have gone in the yard before we noticed him, and he come leading this big buckskin horse from the barnyard right up past the house. And my dad says, hey, he says, where the hell do you think you're going? He says, and this guy's name was Cerny. And he says, my name is Cerny. I just bought this horse, this buckskin horse off of Ferguson. He says, Ferguson? You bought that horse? Not that horse. Ferguson's got a buckskin horse, but it's not that one. You don't have the right horse. Oh, yes. He said, I bought this horse. He said, you did not count and he gave a shove of this hole. He says, you better let go of that rope or I'll cut your head off this hole. And so anyway, my dad says, you go back and get that on the horse. I don't want the damn thing anyway. It's nothing but just eating the hay up, so you can get it. So I walked down with him, and he put a halter on this other old horse and took it out of there, because we didn't want it anyway. It belonged to Ferguson. Well, this farm of ours is about a mile long, and we used to have the cattle clear out in the back end, in the cornfields, after picking the corn, and they'd be browsing around and eating there. And finally one day we said, Jesus, these cows, and one cow ever will go through a fence, the whole damn herd goes. So anyway, we were just looking out north of our place, and here this road had come down from west of our farm. Here come a guy driving a whole herd of cattle down the road. Well, that looks like our cattle. Look at that old spotted one there, He said, I know it's our cattle. So he told John and Dan, and the guy had enough guts, it's over taking. And he had enough guts where he made his mistake. If he was taking them in, to put them in the pond, he should have went right straight on the other way. But he had to drive right in front of our house. Maybe he didn't know they were our cattle. But anyway, John and Dan ran out, and as he dragged these cattle on, they just herded them right up our lane, right into our yard. And this old Pataki, he had a rope he was going to belt one of them with it. He says, you kids, what the hell do you think you're doing? And my dad, he beat it down there, and he told him here, he said, he had a gun. He says, you back up. He said, I'll blow your damn head off. He says, they're my cows. Oh, he says, they're all over in my pasture. He says, over in my cornfield. And he said, I'm going to take them into the pond. He says, you are like fun. He said, you get the hell out of here while you're all together. But anyway, that was what happened to the Pataki. Darn horses used to hang around there in that place. Those just the people that come up from Nebraska and lived in town, never had nothing to do, and half starved. We used to eat over that place all the time. Remember on John and Dad, he thought he'd stay over there most of the time. And I can remember one fall we hung around there, and they were going out to Dogger Lake to cut hay. And he liked John and Dan. And anyway, John or Dan asked, give him a little something. She said, sure, I'll pay him. And he did. I remember that they got all that in Jesus, they're loading up, they loaded all these mobile machines and stuff up these wagons and so the women had to come behind them. Their tents and everything, and they're just getting ready to take off. They were going out the front gate. Why, Darren looks over there and he sees the other team of horses. He's tied behind one of the other hay racks. And anyway, he says, I'm going to take a run for him. He runs a mile west. He says, I'll meet you out there when you get out that far. He saw his mother coming and his big brother. So he wanted to go, and he figured if they get hold of him, he wouldn't get to go. He was about 17 or 18. And so anyway, Mrs. West came up there, and she said, my mother says, hello, Mrs. West. She says, I want Baron. I want Baron. And she says, well, I don't. She says, well, then is the outside there, the rest of the boys? No, he's not out here. And she says, I want him to come home. Well, she says, what about him going along out there? And then boys she said, hey, I don't want him to go out there. I don't want him to go anywhere. I want him to stay home. So anyway, she got mad and she told my mother and I was standing there. And she said, now, I want to tell you something, Mrs. Flynn. If Baron goes to the dad, I'll blame your boys. But you couldn't blame Ben for wanting to go. They always had plenty to eat, and that's what he was after. Every year or two, my mother'd want to go back, took a trip, back to Chicago, which she was, that's who where her mother lived in New Hartford. Of course, my dad was in Chicago. He went back to rent a saloon again. So he rent the saloon back there, and my mother was half the time in South Dakota and half the time in Chicago. The tickets in them days run around $16 one way, and she would go back to Chicago. So this time, we had pool tables and bowling alleys and everything stored out in some of our big barns. When she went away, we set a pool table up in Erected in the living room. And I remember we had these kerosene lamps sitting around on top of different things for light. And we found kids like Pearl Hall and Roller Hall and Joe Grafton and all these different ones. That were around, they come over there and play pool on Sundays, and they come over that evening. Sometime at 1 o'clock in the morning, they had a pool game going on. And they'd stay right there, right up under these eggs and everything. It didn't matter what time of year. If we were shot at food, all we had to do was knock a few chicken broth and skin them and cook it. There was different ones from Chicago used to come out to see Dan and John, such as Otis Clark and Joe Duffy. And they would come out in the fall year and hang around all winter, So while they were there, one of them, they wrote a letter to his cousin. He says, come on out. We had this big house with a big basement. Anyway, he come right out there one night, the train come in, and he walked over to our place. He found out people directed him and lived right west of town. And so anyway, we had a big cellar door on the south side of our house that opened up. It was right under another door that was upstairs. The door that we used to open up just for air in the summer. But the cellar door, you go down the basement right under this door. Well, man, somebody left this door open in the basement. This basement cellar door, prepared this one to keep the snow off, was left open. But the other one in the basement was closed. But anyway, this night this kid come along from Chicago. He walks up to knock on the door, and of course, this doorway was all blown full of snow, and the basement steps going down. He walks right up, and as he goes out of sight, he ends up down under about 5 foot of snow. These guys hung around all winter, and then about the time spring comes, they all took off, warm weather, took off to go different directions, like going home. So anyway, about a month later, this Duffy, old man, wrote a letter to my dad. He wanted to collect for Joe's wages. I know there's nothing fun to do out there on winter but to eat. So my dad made it mad, so he just goes up. He gets that turn in the front of his McDonald. He make out a building back in Chicago. He make it out like a telephone. He says, you send it to him. So he made out this bill to Duffy. He says, your son was out here, and I fed him and kept him all winter. Now I want to collect the board and room. Back McDonald mixed it up. So anyway, there was 2 printing offices in our town, and there was 4 livery barns, 7 saloons, 7 churches, all of them going, living off of a population, I think about that time, 1,000 population. There was 3 doctors in Frederick, and there was Doc Johnson and there was Doc Ayler. Doc Johnson, he was the only one that had any kind of, they never had no hospital at all, just doctors, and if you had something wrong with your hand or then why he, one of sometimes you can go to his office, and most of the time he'd come to the house. John had a broken leg one time. And a horse fell on him, and Doc Johnson came over there and he set his leg. But I remembered after his leg all healed up, John had one leg that was about 3/4 of an inch shorter than the other. He set the leg about 3/4 of an inch short. John always limped after that. Doc Johnson had this big old building that looked like an old hotel, and had a bunch of rooms upstairs over this hotel. And all these different women that were in the family were girls. Even up in the next county, they'd be down there upstairs. A friend of ours by the name of Hayes says, well, he says it's lambing season again. Doc Johnson's got a full house up there. Dr. Ahern, he used to buy milk off of us. We used to sell him milk for $6 a gallon. We used to get 25 cents a gallon to deliver it over to his house. So that's what it cost in them days. And he was a pretty good doctor, but later on in years, him and his wife both were using dope, and they both of them went out of town broke. And after them times, you could buy a good riding horse for around $50 to $60, and to buy a milk cow was worth around $50. Mother used to cost around 25 cents a pound, and egg probably 12 cents, and buy a loaf of milk for about 8 cents. A sack of flour, a 48-pound sack of flour cost you $1.50 at that time. And the sugar was about 5.5 a hundred. A pair of overalls for 75 cents. A good shirt would cost you about 55 cents. When I first started at school, I had school on Main Street. It just like an upstairs. Then later on, we built the schoolhouse. And I can remember a teacher I had, her name was Heather. And she taught 4 different grades. They never had them in kindergarten, then they had 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd, and 4th. And she handled all 4 of them herself. Then later on, there was finally got down to the teachers would handle 1 grade. And that was just like that. It didn't matter how many kids, if there was 100 in the room, they would all be, she'd teach them all. But I can remember being in 1 grade, another grade teaching them, but seemed to work out all right then. School teachers back in them times were getting around $50 to $60 a month for teaching the class. We were the only ones in town that had a monkey. And anyway, this teacher found out that we got this pet monkey, and so she knew that most of these children in school never did see one. So one Friday, this teacher told Margaret asked her if she would bring the monkey to school so the children could see this monkey. And so anyway, she asked Ma if you would like to take Jocko the monkey up there, and she said, oh, sure. So anyway, she takes this monkey up there, but before they took him up there, they had a little red jacket on and a little cap, you know. And they had this line on, this little chain on it, and Margaret let him along, and he run along there, you know. We take him up to school, and we get to the school, and of course, all these kids are waiting there, all these guests, and Margaret, she leads them in, and of course, he looks so comical, you know, jumping around on this line, and so pretty soon, we quieted down pretty well, and they were all looking, you know, at this monkey, and so they says, this teacher said to Margaret, why don't you just turn him loose and let him, you can see what he does, go around, and she had snapped him and let him loose, and he was going around and mucking around, the kids all laughing, getting a big bang out of it. Finally, anyway, there was an organ sitting in the corner, it had a big mirror sitting up on this organ, and this mirror didn't even have a frame on it, just a big piece of plate glass, a mirror. So anyway, this monkey's jumping around, he jumped up on the organ, he saw this mirror up there, and he thought he saw another monkey, and he jumped into it, and the damn mirror started falling. So when it started falling, he made a jump, he lit on the floor, you know, sort of lit on the floor, and the damn mirror comes out, and cut his tail right off about an inch from his rear end. There's the other stub there, and chopped it right off. And this monkey, he just goes wild, and he runs all over the school, making an awful noise, and the kids were scared to death. The monkey's running to one way to try to get out, and another one, and I remember, he jumped up and tried to get out of his wind, and he grabbed this big shake, and he let go of it. Up and went bang, and the teacher got all excited, opened the damn schoolhouse door, and the monkey out he went, and he headed right straight home. And Margaret, she didn't know if she better go home or not. After this monkey ran home with this little sharp tail. But anyway, it was all fixed up anyway. But that was there. And I can remember that monkey used to sit, my dad would come home from Jen and Myers Sloan, he'd sit in his chair, and this monkey used to come right over there and sit down alongside him on the floor, you know, and he'd kind of rub up against my dad's leg. My dad used to scratch that tail of his sticking out, you know, like this monkey look up, you know, like he really enjoyed that. When I got a kick, my dad would sit down, he'd start reading the newspaper, and he'd be reading, well, this monkey was sitting on his shoulder, and my mother used to say, look in the other room at Robinson Crusoe, there he is, the monkey. But I can remember one time I was watching him, this damn monkey got excited, he just jumped in wherever, he hit that damn paper, took it right out of my dad's hands, you know, when he was sleeping. And another time, my mother got out of some Nicky Gander, and she was about 5, 6 years old, and she was on the front porch, and this monkey was looking at her, and she was sucking out of his hands. He was kind of chatting, you know. She didn't know what he was chatting about. But he saw all what the monkey did the big leap, and he hits her, and she falls on his back, and her mouth flew wide open, and this monkey had to stick a candy, and away he went. Took off to the barnyard. He used to hang around with the dogs, and when you throw them out something to eat, you know, he'd always like potatoes now. My mother tossed him a red hot potato above the potato in the field and got right out of the gun. He'd grab that thing and the damn hot, he just bent from one hand to the other. He wouldn't drop it, lay it down, he said it, and he just keep tossing it back and forth like a guy juggling a ball until it cooled off, and then he'd get the peeling off, and then he'd eat it. He just about liked to eat anything, but he never liked raw meat. Grounds of beef, that's what he called a chub joe, but he never did the damn meat that wasn't cooked. In the summertime, early in the morning, just about daylight, he'd go out and get a telephone pole in front of the house. He used to climb that telephone pole, and he'd shake that, you could hear the wires traveling on the side of the house, making a tune. And pretty soon they come out of the big high power line, down the front of our place, that's the ground. One of these big high voltage ones, 3 wires. So when they put that in, running anyway, got a chain, a big chain, and put it on old Jocko, and we hook him on the clothesline, and then he'd run back and forth from one end of the clothesline to the other, and finally one day, he'd blow a hole right through them ringers on the clothesline wires, going back and forth, and he went up on this high line, stand clear up into the top, ground over one of the high power wires, put all the lights out and ground, and the power line went to ground, and burned his feet and hands to death. Didn't kill him, but we had to shoot him later on. I remember the day we shot him, I told my dad came over there. Hands full of maggots, it just burned so bad he never could use them. So we took him out behind the best grave for him, and anyway, just kind of took him back to the bottom of the shot. Put him in the stove back there and buried the grave, and they buried him. That was the last of them. Found out this monkey from Smoky in Wood, South Dakota. He had 2 of them, and they were always fighting, so he felt sorry for this smaller one, so he told my dad he could take him if he wanted to, you know, and he would like him if we did. Well, I'll take him. So anyway, we brought him home. He was quite a deal around our place. We never needed any circuses there because there was always one going on. And also, I remember in the wintertime we had a big log house and we had a bunch of pins out there. There were these old sows, and those would have pigs where they'd be pinned up in these pins. We had about 24 of them on these log houses. But I remember they had a bunch of windows in it, but not small windows. And anyway, one of these little windows was knocked out. That was just right for him. He could go in and get in there and out all winter. And anytime he'd be outside, if he couldn't get into our house, he'd head down there and he'd jump up on the roof and he'd go through this window. Many a time I walked in there, just slipped in there, you know. All these sows were laying around in their pens. And he would be laying right up against their tits, you know, to keep warm. He'd get between their legs and one of their tits and he'd lay there and be looking out, you know, where it was nice and warm for him. One time Margaret and I were walking out back in our farm there, and of course this monkey found us along with this Margaret. I guess he had like a piece of the candy and jawbreakers in her mouth, and I had none. We were walking along, and chattering along behind us, they're running along, you know. Pretty soon, all at once, he gave her hell of a leap, and he jumped up on Marty's shoulder, and he bit her on the neck. He jumped up and hit her back home. One time, my mother was scrubbing the floor. She had a broom, some water. He had this hard maple flooring. She used to suspect a little lie on that, you know, by the door he walked in, and that was more dirty in. So she just spec a lie there, and then let it sit a while, and then pretty soon she'd come back and pour a little water on it, hot water, and then brush it. So you know, to let this puppy come along, and he was pretty sneaky. He could just come right up and take the head of the screen door, and he could just pull that open and slip in there so easy. He used to do that, you know, and always looking around. If wouldn't dare leave a sugar bowl on the table, he'd make a leap and he'd be up there and grab a handful of sugar and beat it again. But anyway, this time he'd come in, you know, and he sat down on this, where she sprinkled his lie, and Jesus, all at once, he jumped up and he swung around, and Jesus, he ran out the back door, screeching, and he yelled, and he slid on his behind, clear across the yard, heading for the barnyard. It was just a cloud of dust after him. You know, in the wintertime, sometime it'd get down to 25, 30 below zero. Of course, we had a small cage that was built out of this chicken netting, and so all about 3-4 foot square. We used to bring him in, and we'd put him in this cage back in the corner so that he wouldn't freeze to death. He didn't have much hair on him. And anyway, I remembered we had this ferret. My dad had a ferret. When we'd go hunting rabbits, we'd pick him up back of the buttes, and I used to carry this ferret. I was around about 10 years old, and we'd walk along in this big snowbank, and pretty soon we'd see a place where a hole we could shove the ferret in, and we'd put him in there, and my dad would stand back with a shotgun, and you'd hear these rabbits or something like hell coming out of it. These ferret would run him out. But of course, if he ever caught one, well, he'd suck the blood out of them, and geez, he'd lay down and go to sleep. So many a time we'd have to plug a hole and look around that there wasn't other holes where he could get out either, because we may lose him. And he was, any place he could get his head, he could get in. But I remember this time the monkey, my dad had this ferret, and cold weather never bothered him, and we kept him in a big wooden rain barrel on that back porch, that back of our house, and a lot of straw in there. And we'd drop in a little bread and milk, you know, and could put it down there and feed him. But this morning was just colder than hell, so he thought he'd bring it in just in the house, so we could see it. We fed that thing in the house, but I remembered after he got done eating, why, he ran around the wall and around, and pretty soon he ran up to where this monkey's cage was. It was one of these big wire meshes, a pretty good size opening, and he just goes right in, and all at once we could hear a hell of a screeching in there. And the monkey, he had this ferret right by the neck, holding him up from him. So we had to get the door open quick and get him loose from the ferret. The ferret would really go after him too, but he had the ferret, but he had these two front eyes. He was right around his neck, and the ferret couldn't even, he was squirming like hell, like a big angry worm, and get him loose, and then he'd come back at him again, so my dad had to drag him out. One time, Bob Rock talked to Mario about them and stayed overnight. Of course, the next morning when John woke up, and he happened to look up, and here he sees this monkey looking at him. His unbreakable was looking down at him. He kind of scared him at first. He didn't know what the hell to think of, if it was real or not. But he found out it was. Anyway, after a while, he got up, and he stayed and he had dinner and so forth, and potatoes and gravy, and he just got a kick out of it, and nothing. So anyway, I got some gravy, put some gravy in the potatoes, and he just kept him back, took the spoon, and he just licked it right off, put it right back into the gravy. First time we always would bring somebody different home now and then, and finally got acquainted with a colored guy. This guy's name was Oscar Esau, and he was a homesteader down south by Carlock. And while he was putting his homestead years there, he wrote a book while he was around about the homesteader, was the name of it. And he gave my dad one of these books later on after he had it published. And I don't know how he ever made out with the book, but I suppose there's a few of them are around yet. But we did have one at one time. He was a well-dressed colored fellow. And the year that I'm talking about is about around 1913, 14. He was still farming out there. And around that time, I can remember there was one other colored fellow out there. I remember I drove the car to John DeVille, and then he lived out there. And we used to go, and his name was, her name was Fischer, and I remember Mrs. Canary, which was, DeVille it was. She was Canary one time, but she married John DeVille. And I stayed with him for about a month while I was showing him good helper. She was sick, and Mrs. DeVille wanted to see her, and so I went over there, and I was in this two-room house, and I can remember it as well as day as I did that. But I can remember she was laying in bed. We knocked on the door, and she hollered, "Come on in!" So he goes in there, and Mrs. DeVille says, "Well, how are you, Mother? I want to know." And she says, "Well, I was so sick last night, I thought I was going to fill up my toenails." And I couldn't help but laughing away, but she was coming out of it. That was the second front end. And then there was a couple colored people around Gregory. They had one, he was a carpenter, Jake Rupert, run a saloon on the corner. He got a colored car, lived in a little shack behind his saloon. And I used to talk to him quite a bit. And then my dad had a friend that was a barber. He had a barber shop. His name was Billy Moore. And I can remember this Billy Moore. My dad always, I don't know, he always liked, this guy, somebody said, "All right, go on over there and get a haircut." He said, "I don't have time to cut your hair. I'm too busy. I'm going on hunting." So you go over and Billy will cut your hair. And I used to go over there quite a bit. And I remember at that time it cost us, I think it was $1 to get a haircut. And if the guy would get a shave, it was either 10 or 15 cents to get a shave in that days. But I remember this. There wasn't very many bathtubs around in South Dakota. Most of these people, they take a wash bath, take a bath. They eat water on the stove, and then they take a bath in their kitchen and so forth. But the barber shops used to have a bathtub, and they charge you $1 to furnish you a towel and for you to take a bath. Many a time I went up to the barber shop and after I got a haircut, to take a bath. There was a fellow in Gregory, he had a gambling house. His name was Frank Robbins, and Frank Robbins, of course, he had roulette wheels in there, and they would play cards or any kind of a game you wanted to play. He was a professional gambler, and I remember he was a friend of my dad's, and I remember one time they wanted to run him out of town, so he heard they were going to raid him, so my brother, Dan and John, both of them, they went up there at night with a wagon, and they brought home all his gambling equipment. He had 2 roulette wheels, and about 2 great big grain sacks, which are bigger than gunny sacks, full of poker chips of different color, red and blue and white. I can remember some of them. And a couple of these here ivory balls for the roulette wheel. And I can remember we took them over home. We could take the legs off these roulette wheels. And they had one under each one of the boys' bed. And I remember we used to get a few of the poker chips out. We used to make a whistle out of them. We'd eat them and then grab them and put a couple holes in them. You put them in your mouth and made a pretty good whistle. This Robbins also, this gambler, he also had some pictures of making wine in Italy, you know. They showed these side views of these Italian girls who were in these big wine vats, walking around, crushing the grapes barefooted. He had a couple of big pictures, different ones, big ones. And of course, after he didn't know what to do with these pictures, so he took them over to Billy Moore, this colored guy's barber shop. And I'd love to have it why he had him in there, you know. And first the colored guy, he didn't realize that thing. He thought that was all right, you know. Didn't want to get a kick on looking at these pictures. And anyway, he had a fire, and then pretty soon, you know, he got it all straightened up again and cleaned up, and by God, here he has another fire. So anyway, he got thinking that maybe he had bad luck. So anyway, one day I was in the haircut. After he had a fire and he got clean, got the joint all cleaned up again. And what they used to have to heat water in the back was a gasoline, an open burner. The tank was up on an iron pipe, you know, about 3-4 foot over these burners. There'd be 2 burners. And we had 2 or 3 of them stoves. My dad had them for his tent camping, you know. And you didn't need pressure in them at all. It was just pour the gas in, it was gravity feed. You'd turn the burner over a bit, run a little gasoline in the cup under it, light it when it got warm, you could open it up, and you had a nice burner. It was good for cooking with gasoline. And so anyway, this stove got away from him a couple times, but it got caused his fire. But after that, I was sitting in there, and some guy with another party, he was cutting his hair, you know. And pretty soon, everybody come by, you know, would love to see what the hell the fire did. They saw he was open again. So there was another prostitute who used to live in our town, and her name was Mally Hall. She was quite a go-getter, and anyway, she come along, and she was lifting the whip, and he saw her looking at him, you know, and he really got his brother. He says, "My Lord," he says, "you took out of that black bear in the cage," he says, "where they keep looking in here." And he said, that moment he just looked at her, that Mally Hall. He said, "I wouldn't go out with her." He said, I'd rather have my thing in a red hot stove than in her. He said it wouldn't get burned any worse. I'll never forget that. I was a kid about 12 years old at that time. Then they had finally, Pat Gregory. I remember I got a postcard from him. He went to Omaha, Nebraska, and that's where the last I heard of him, he would drop me a line from there, telling me what he was doing. If I ever come to Omaha, to be sure and stop and see him. This time, he goes back to Chicago to run his stone again. My mother, she stayed in South Dakota for a while. Well, he went back and he had a party there and was running his restaurant. He had a big building, it was 150 foot long. And we lived upstairs when we were living there, but he stayed there alone upstairs. And anyway, I went back. So I remember going back and starting school back there. And because he figured my mother would be back pretty quick. So he goes back and I go to school. So the first thing I met some of these kids. Well, I've been to these schools before, but if you're gone for 2 or 3 years and you come back, you got to fight 3 or 4 kids before you know that they'll let you alone. So I can remember this woman that worked for my dad runs this restaurant park, her name was Sarah McElligan. And so Sarah, she gave me a coat, and this brown coat was big enough to fit a kid that was 5 years older than I am. And I remember the sleeve hung down, clear down there to past my knuckles. And anyway, and there's the from school and that back and forth. I met a kid named Slater, and he was a kid that had 2 or 3 different parents. He was checked around, and I remember he used to come home from school and get the rest of the back. And another kid named Bill Irving, and Bill Irving had a brother, and his folks brought him a pair of roller skates. And they wasn't like today, everybody throws anything they have, in children. They just can't buy them. And that's what's the matter with the kids today. That's why they're spoiled. And we'd have to work all day, do something in order to get a quarter. We had to do a man's work for a quarter all day. But these kids now, if their folks hand them $1, they're scoffed at their parents. But what their parents should do is knock their ears down a little bit, and they make better kids out of it. I find out that these kids, that their parents are helping all the time, I have never saw one yet that ever amounted to anything. The ones that really turn out good are the ones that stick paper out, and they earn their own money, and they pay their own way. And they're the ones that get ahead in the world. Well, they know what an hour is. And when they're given, these children are given everything to like they are today, they don't amount to much. They always figure somebody's going to help them. And they don't do the kid any good by giving them. They're doing them more harm than good. What they should do is let a kid get on his own, get out and earn it. Even if he can't say it'd be hardly anything, he knows what $1 is or a quarter. But in them days, a laborer only got a couple dollars a day. Because I know, I went through that. I felt remember something like that. Small like that. And we'd sell this junk, and that's where we'd get our spending money to buy stuff. And I even traded junk, for, I knew a guy named Timberg, a chairman from the old country. I used to sell him lead and stuff that I picked up. And I remember I traded him enough lead to get 2 big water buckets to galvanize one. To carry water from their well to the house. That's the difference of then and today. Getting back to this kid that had the roller skates, Bill Irving, and his brother, one day one would use the skates, and the next day the other one would use the skates. But anyway, this one night after school was walking along, and this Bill had this pair of roller skates, and his brother come running up, and he wanted the skates. He said, "It's my day to use the skates," and Bill says, "Well, last night, I know it was supposed to be mine, but you had the skates last night using them, so I figured as long as you used them last night, I would use them today." And he says, "No, today is supposed to be my day," and he started hollering around, and a bunch of kids went up, and I remember these kids were a bunch of, was afraid to get nail kicked out of us. And so anyway, just one kid said, "Oh, I'll get the skates," and he ran up, and he was going to hit me. I didn't have a skate, but I had the roller skate key, and I had it right between my fingers. The point of it stuck out right between my 2 long fingers, and I had my fist doubled up, and the back of the key was in the back of my hand. And so when he went up, I sidestepped him in this big black coat, was nearly dragging the ground. So I swung on him, and I caught him right over the right eye, and the key went, just cut a groove over from the right above his eye, clear back to the top of his head. It looked like a rat's tail, and he went down, he fainted. And it scared me, I thought I'd killed him, so I started to a doctor somewhere. He said, I don't know, but he walked on his own, so he's all right, don't be afraid. I said, I thought I'd kill him when I saw that skin all hanging loose and his bleeding on the forehead. And he said, I think they'll never bother you anymore. I heard them talking, they didn't know what you hit him with. One of them said he must have had a big old ring or something on the way he cut his head. They never bothered me after that. I didn't have to fight any more kids up in the fighting over right. Along about towards Christmas time, we were, my folks were right back out to South Dakota in Chicago, and back and forth and riding. And now and then they'd be on a train, one of them boys, John or Dan, would come back, and they'd stay a couple of weeks, and then they'd go back. I think we brought half of the Northwestern Railroad. There was always somebody on that train going back and forth. In them days, you could buy a ticket. Full fare was about $14, and they'd go back and forth. And I remember that that was the year, 1915. They had all the damn snow. They had blizzards, and the goddamn railroad from all up and down the line, from Nebraska line clear up into South Dakota. It was for a week sometimes. There wasn't a train would come in. When the month of January, at that time, there was 2 trains a day that used to come in. There used to be a train that come in right after dinner, about 2 o'clock, and then in the evening there was another one about 7:30 at night with coming passengers. And there was a lot of freight trains in them days. Everything was running good. And I remember that they had a snowplow. I still have a picture of it, where there's these big open cuts where they went between the hill where they cut the railroad banks down. They were full of solid with snow, and they had these big rotary snowplows. And hell, it took them days to get up as far as Dallas and Winter. Snowbanks, every here and there'd be a big snowbank, and even some of them had a bunch of cattle that got loose and got in them in the blizzard, and then there was snow shut. And when this rotary come along, had a big fan in front of it. It was flowing bones and cows and everything else out of these big open cut snowbanks. I remember there was a guy from Dallas who was taking a picture off one of these snowbanks, and the damn snowbank caved off and he killed himself. He fell down. It was so deep. Had the snow at 15, 18 foot deep in some of them open cuts. We'd run into them several times, and longer away, and man, hell, the time really getting through, But they finally made it. They got it open. And I remember that next spring again, after school's out, I goes back to South Dakota, and they're farming there, and I remember it was such a wet spring and summer that when the wheat and stuff all was getting ripe, it was in July, along in the later part of July and August, that it just we had so much rain that there was late beds out in the wheat fields. And them days you had to pull the miners with teams of horses for run by the power of the horses. Probably had a big bull wheel run on the ground. And I remember we tried everything to cut this to get power to run it. We even tried to rig up a gas engine on the back, a big old gas engine, but we didn't have the right hookups to really get it running. So I remember we bought an engine, a Cushman engine that was made to Lincoln, Nebraska, weighed 150 pounds, and I remember afterwards they said, well, it weighed 150 pounds, and it cost us $150. It was $1 a pound is what that engine cost today. But we could use that engine for several other things. We used to use it to run our wash machine. And that was about the first power wash machine we had. We'd run it with this Cushman engine. And that's that. Well, in the fall, after this rain's on cutting fast, and then I goes on back to Chicago again. And still that's where my folks were in John and Dan. They run the farm. And I first went to Chicago, went to Mount Rainier School for a while. First they sent me to St. Margaret's School over on 99th Street. But we had to get on the streetcar to go over there. And my sisters over there was a Daphne. They used to beat the hell out of us with rubber hose. So anyway, I wouldn't go anymore. I says, I'm not going. So they said, okay, go on out to Mount Rainier School. That's where I went. And I got along pretty good at Mount Rainier School. I liked it. Bunch of Highlanders there and that, but I never had no trouble there after hitting this one kid and nearly scalping him. That straightened them things out. I never had no trouble after that. And I remember pretty soon, my dad always too, you run this slow, and there was all these different characters hanging around. And I remember one time there, he had this water hungry, he thought of it, he's a kind of a coot, and he would go around from one stone to the other, He'd hang out any damn place that they'd leave to stay, he'd stay. And so anyway, he started sleeping in our basement by a boiler room, and he would go around there and he'd do things, and we fed him, and he'd go in and out of the basement. This one day, they had a trap door. My dad had a short way of going to the basement in case he'd be alone there. He had a trap door he could open the top. And he could go right straight down, it was about 10, 12 foot deep there, right down in the basement by the beer barn where he got all his beer out there. You know, they had his draft beer. If you wanted to go down there to see about changing over different barrels of beer, or to get something out of it, was taste of beer sitting out of his tailway. But anyway, this day, this Walter, he was tucking in and out, he was racing down duck, he'd get in and out. He went down there and he opened his trap door and it was wide open, and there's a hole in there about 3 foot each way, square. And my dad was talking to a guy, and my dad went back up to go to the bar, get something off the back bar, and he stepped into this hole, he fell down, and he broke some ribs on this stairway. That put him in the butt for a while. I think one of these, like his ribs, one of them kind of punctured his lungs, because after that, when he'd get out, he couldn't hardly walk. He used to can walk for miles and miles, I think. But after that cut him down. That bothered him so bad he couldn't hardly, it just really slowed him right up because he couldn't hardly breathe. And if it happened, like today, they may be able to figure that something. Some days they didn't know what the hell to do. You were lucky just to be alive. The hospital was just a place to go in and out of the entrance. So I remember for about a year he got around there, and this damn water, you know, this free help, people get this free help around. They better base them these free help around because it don't mean a damn thing unless they're paying their way and learning what the hell they know what they're doing. But anyway, that was what happened to him, and anyway, he says, the hell with that guy, I don't want him around here, so he kept him out of there. But he used to come in, you know, he thought he was a fire chief, and he was telling he used to get talking at the bar, different ones, and they said, Roger, customers say, well, Walter, he was Walter Hunter, do you have any fires to pay? No, he says, not today, we had one yesterday down back in a certain lot, he said, back there. I said, I heard you saved the well anyway, the house burned down, you saved the well, and you really thought he was a fireman, but I'd laugh. He'd go in and out of one of these stones, and there's several of them around there, these restaurants, at the foot of the hills from the cemeteries where all the people would come in and eat after a funeral. But anyway, one day there was a couple guys come in from up towards Chicago. In the alley, back of our place. And I remembered O'Malley had a big flock of geese. He had a big board fence around the back of his restaurant now. He had a big corner lot, all kinds of room. And these geese were out in the alley, and I remember that what happened anyway, these guys, in the meantime, they were doing things my dad didn't know, but anyway, this rather hungry, and he heard that, or saw or something, these guys caught a couple of these big geese and they put them in gunny sacks, and they put them under my dad's stairway. So anyway, this goddamn Walter, instead of telling my dad about it, my dad didn't know they were there. He went down and he told O'Malley, he says, you know, O'Malley says, Flynn's got a couple of your geese up there under his stairway. And geese went back there and he looked at who they were and he turned them out. And maybe it's a goddamn mad. He says, Walter Hungry was telling O'Malley down there. He says, that's why I'm up here to tell you. He says, he might be coming up here. So anyway, my daddy turned him out. So that day, he put a little Walter on the blacklist. My dad didn't have the use for him, but I'd laugh anyway. He was so goddamn mad at what happened to him and him getting hurt and falling down there. But I remember I was in the saloon there standing by a slot machine and looking at the slot machine, and then I see this Walter come in, and there was nobody in the saloon other than my dad. He was behind the bar. And anyway, when Walter, he walks in, he's standing right in front of a big plate glass window. My dad, he reaches under the bar, and he gets a great big potato masher. Must have brought it out of the kitchen. I didn't know he had it there, but I saw it. He took that thing out of there, and he wound that thing up, he swung around. Walter was right in front of the big plate glass window, looking like Bucky, and didn't know enough to say nothing or anything. He just stood there and wound this thing around about a couple times, and he let go and hit him right on top of the head. Anyway, Walter went down on his knees, and I thought, boy, is he going to come out of this or not? Run over to the door on his hands and knees, and out the door he goes, and heads right up into the cemetery. Anyway, about an hour later, I thought, I better go up there and see if Walter's still making it. Might be dead. So I went up there, and here he's sitting on a tombstone. He was rubbing his head. And I said, well, how are you, Walter? And he said, I'll be all right, I guess. So anyway, he walks down the hill. He walks like that, past my dad, so he heads over to another getting back to all of this, he was the guy that was the cause of my father's death around a year later. Why, my dad never did feel after that, Bob couldn't walk or hardly a thing. He just got him down. But anyway, Bob bought a gun off of Joe Lamo. Somebody had a bunch of them that they got somewhere. And I remember it was an L.C. Smith shotgun, a double barrel, and a trap gun for shooting clay pigeons and hunting. My dad, he takes the streetcar and heads for downtown, and he gets down there and he goes to some sporting goods store and he bought a barrel of clay pigeons and a trap shooting out there to feel that for putting these clay pigeons in and shooting them off, and that way he could practice a little bit on these clay pigeons. Like didn't practice up. But at the same time he was down there that day to get this stuff, he got awful sick. Finally, anyway, he went to the Mercy Hospital, which is not far from right downtown, and from there he stayed overnight. So the next day, he comes on home, and about 3-4 days he was around home, and then he started getting worse. And finally, anyway, they took him over to Blue Island to a little hospital over there. So he was over there for 3-4 days, and he kept getting worse. And finally, anyway, I was walking on the street around about Anthony hollered at me and says, hey, he says, come over here. He says, your dad's over in that hospital, you're going to Blue Island. I said, yes, I know. Well, he says, here's card. He says, you don't have any money here. He says, you get me in half an hour. He says, you better go on over there and see your dad because I don't think he's going to be around much longer. So anyway, I takes the streetcar from 111th Street and I went over to St. Vincent's Avenue. The tram car gets this in an urban streetcar that goes to Kankakee, but it goes to Blue Island, went right by this hospital, so it gets off there. And I sees my dad there, and Mom was there, and anyway, I was talking to him for about 15-20 minutes, and he told me, he said, I'm never going to get out of here alive. He says, I've had it. He says, then got long. A couple days, and I won't be there. He wasn't. Finally passed away, and anyway, I remember he took his body down to 59th laughing. Mom had a partner, Dennis Allen, husband at that time. He runs slow for his father on 59th Street. So anyway, that's where they had the wake, his Molly's anyway. From there they had these great big limousines, hearses, and I can remember that's where the funeral started. And from Molly's place, we went way downtown to some old neighborhood, I guess where Pa used to go to church years ago, before, when they were first married. And they drove all the way down there. That's where they had the services. And then from there, they come all the way on back to Mount Olivet Cemetery, and that's where they buried him. Well, anyway, after that, my mother run the saloon a while. Of course, John and Dan, they were firemen, and my mother had a bartender by the name of Henry Howard that used to tend bar, and anyway, I think he was making more money, and Rob still like most people doing it. No, they can get away with it, they'll do it. But it seems funny to me at that time, John was pretty big, he wasn't a little kid anymore, and it's funny that somebody like him wouldn't have kind of stayed right there then and kind of run this business. But it wasn't much longer after that, another year or two, and the whole country went dry. They voted it dry. And that was along about 1916 and 18, along in there. And they had the war was on with Germany, and so they went and they voted the United States dry. So she finally closed it up and pulled out and went back to South Dakota, which is the worst thing she ever did. Go back there, she might have stayed where she was at. Because none of us ever did anything in South Dakota to get ahead there. Anyway, back in South Dakota, I met David Stein and Becker. He wanted to buy our farm. The farm at that time was nothing but a bunch of buildings, stuff moved up together, looked like the High Chaparral. And he offered my mother $25,000 for it at that time. And I thought there was an awful lot of money at that time. And I said to her, I said, why don't you take it, and then we'll move to Omaha, Nebraska. And down there, I said, I can get a job. I'm just ready to go to work now. And I said, I don't want to stay out here and farm, but she stayed out there. And she went and started putting getting along. She helped John buy he had 50 head of cows that he bought. And she gave him money to buy them and yellow horses and stuff. And then Dan, she put him in the farming business, not only doing all this, but what we had, she goes ahead, and builds a house right on the farm there, and everything. And then for $6,000 to keep on going, and build it up. And later on in years, as time went on, the damn drought come on, best farm, nobody raised anything. Hell, she never did take something off that farm when we put it in. That was the worst mistake she ever made. She would at least, when we went to Omaha, she had a good house and modern, and one of the best houses down there, all nice brick and that. But she didn't see it that way. I finally went back down to Omaha, and I got a job working for you, driving a truck. And we were selling electrical supplies, farm-like plants, equipment like that. And anyway, I worked for him for quite a while. There was a guy named Wilson that really, he was the biggest owner of the damn thing. So finally, anyway, at that time, Wilson was in kind of a wildcat oil drilling. He was down in Oklahoma. They drilled down there and they finally get oil drilling. And pretty soon, I thought, I wanted a lot of excitement. So I get it down there. I worked down there firing 4 weeks. World from there, west into California, another oil fields everywhere. We're there. I'll never forget the different things that took place. I could go on and on talking, but anyway, I worked for quite a while. John also, he was down there. He got it because he'd like to start a moving picture theater. He had another oil field over in another district. And so he goes over and puts $500 down on a vacant lot, which was on a main street. He was over there one day. So he took off for Gregory to see his cult. He was going to get him to go in with him. He was going to start the theater, but by the time he went up to Gregory back, a few days went by. By the time a few days went by, when they got back down there were underfloor theaters built in operation. Sound pictures, they were built on a little corrugated iron, all these buildings. And I'm going to get a job there. One day I heard somebody screaming out of a restaurant. She was all on fire. She put gasoline, more than old gasoline, stoves there, the gas tank way up on a little pipe, the sun spilled over and shit. So she was out there in the street and on fire. Gasoline rolling her around and just two died. I can remember these Texas Rangers coming into town and they were, looking for law and order. So we stayed around there a while, and pretty soon the big oil boom was just about over there, everything under control, and I remember I went on back to Omaha, and in the meantime, Jim was this Wilson, and he used to come back and forth from Oklahoma, and he'd have a big Pierce-Arrow car, one of them big limousines with the headlights clear out on the fenders, So, anyway, one day, Jim knew a guy by the name of Joe Wolf. So Joe Wolf, he used to have 410-2 taxi cabs. He had big license. And Joe Wolf told Jim, he said, I've got a friend. He said, this guy has got the patents on fire escape. This guy's been drunk ever since his wife died on the day that we were at marriage time. And anyway, he's all upset. He's been drinking. So he said, I'd like you to meet him. So Jim went over to this place, his hotel, and met this curly father. He told Jim the trouble you have. He said, if you give me $500, he says, I'll give you half of that interest in the damn business. And Jim said, well, I'll look it over tonight and I'll come back. I'll see you. I'll let you know when we're if I want to go into this adventure. So Jim thought it over. They had 110 of these fire escapes at that time when it was a little smaller. And it was a pretty damn good looking deal, So Jim got thinking, well, hell, he said, for half of that. And they used to sell for about $350. So all it looked like it was still like, so it's like, I don't know. So finally Jim got his mind going. He thought, well, the school board will do $350 for one. They'll pay $750 or maybe more. So he went in with him and he took over and controlled it and he run it. And anyway, that was the beginning of Jim getting where he was when he went on and for years and made good. So at the same time, I even used to work for Jim, installing these fire escapes all over the United States, Michigan, Tennessee, and everywhere. Illinois was everywhere. I got a lot of travelers. I traveled thousands of miles, all over, everywhere. So that was the first experience I had of traveling around the United States. I covered about 40 states. Well, he had that until finally the Depression come on, and of course Dan worked for him too, and I was laid off. He preferred to help Dan, and of course Dan worked for him, and when he didn't have work, he could draw money on him, and this and that. So Dan stayed with him. It was the best thing I ever did. Anyway, I spent quite a bit of time during that Depression trying different angles to make a living. I also built myself a big saw, and I used to go up on the Missouri River, and I paid the fellow $1 for a whole truckload of wood. I cut these trees down, these great big cottonwoods, and I had this saw, the big blade on it, about 5 foot across. It's a big sawmill, literally, and I changed the teeth on it to a crosscut. And I used to go all the way up there with this truck, and I'd haul a big load of the cotton. I got about 8 or 9 tons of it, because most of it was greenwood. Of course, a lot of it I cut down Crags too. When I looked back at that time, I was selling that wood. I'd get probably $10 for a whole truckload. Where now, you get $40, $50 for just a quarter. But still, it's reasonable to pay that for it. So, doing that, and besides that, I was doing some bootleg and anything to make $1. And at one time, I remember there was nothing to do around there. There was no jobs around there outside of WPA. So you'd work on that, they'd only let you work so many hours a week. And they didn't really think you couldn't go over $5, $6. So you got to how many children. So get that, and then again, one time I painted that Catholic priest house. I got $2 a day for painting. For putting the paint in. I worked there for about 10, 12 days. I painted that priest house. The times really were tough then. And tell anyone now about times then that goes over their head like a tent. You don't even hear it. You don't want to hear it. I know a lot of people that were living on here with nothing. And if you didn't have somebody get it or something, well, you wouldn't have that. But nobody ever gave me anything. I worked for everything I ever got. And anyway, I even also had I was even manufacturing whiskey, anything to make money. It didn't make a difference. They never did bother anyone much, only if they selling it to the Indians or some young kid, but I never did sell it to any young kids if I could help them. And I remember one time Irish Anderson and I, we were cutting wood together down on Whetstone Creek. We could get a permit from the boss farmer and cut this off the Indian land. So we cut this wood and haul it in, you know. And I had this saw, we could saw it up. But I remember this day we was coming in, you know, I had this big truckload and Jesus, as big as a hay rack, you know, and I blowed a tire out. I remember I got home about 8:30 at night. It was late in the fall and the winter, going into winter, cold weather. November it was. And I remember when I pulled over to where my place where I lived with this oil station that was hadn't closed, but I used that to live in, and that's where I lived. So anyway, I remember this night I come home and everything was dark there, you know, in the house, and I finally Gussie came to the door and I said, "What's the matter?" She said, "Well, the Internal Revenue men are all over town today." She said, "John Bean called me up and told me they were in town," so I thought I better not even go to the answer the door if somebody come along. I wasn't selling any whiskey by the pint, and I was selling it by the gallon. And I had this great big still in my basement, 8 barrels of mash underneath my basement, where I was making this stuff. But anyway, I says, well, hell, if they didn't show up around now, they probably won't come anyway. So I wasn't afraid they'd already caught this Irish Anderson that was with me. That's what, when he got home that night, he'd already searched his house. He used to sell whiskey by the pint. And he sold it to some Indian. This Indian was in with the Internal Revenue. And anyway, they come to his house and they knew just where to get it. He kept it in the front of an old phonograph. He could raise out in front of it, kind of a cloth with kind of a scroll cut on it where that sound comes out. He could raise that up, and there's where he'd have his whiskey. They knew just where it was, and they went and got it. I remember he had it all the time. For a long time, they were driving back and forth to Sioux Falls, having court on that. And when I look back, I can figure I was always there lucky. I never did have any any close calls like that. That was the closest I ever got to get in. Well, finally, anyway, I went and saw these houses. We weren't to buy these houses off the farms for anything. I bought one out north of Gregory for around, paid them $300 for it. Then I got a house mover, $300 to move it. The same house in 1917 or 18 cost $8,000 to build it. So I moved it in, and I borrowed the $800 off of Jim so I could pay for the house, move it in, and I had enough money to buy a little cement wise, because I had to have enough money to buy some windows and stuff because some of them were knocked out. We fixed it up, buy sinks and stuff. But I remember I got it all fixed up, and then later on I took a notion, well, hell, this war business was getting closer. And this here was about 6 months before Pearl Harbor. We were in Gregory, and anyway, they were making airplanes for foreign countries. And so anyway, I thought, well, hell, I'll go to Seattle. So Vic Lindholm and his wife and a couple of kids, they had a relation living over the Bucco. So anyway, they says, let's go on out. So I went with them, and we started on a trip. And by God, we got as far as Yellowstone Park, and Ida Lindholm, Vic's wife, who was Gussie's sister, got awful sick, and I thought, by God, she was going to die. She was throwing up all the time. And so Vic says, shall we go on to Seattle? And I said, hell, you don't need to go on there on account of me. And I said, to turn around, I said, and we'll head back to Gregory. Because Gregory is one of the kids, the oldest girl, Lindholm girl, who stayed at Gregory, and she knew some fellow that she finally married later on. But anyway, we went back, and in 4 or 5 days, they turned around, they headed back from Illinois where they lived. And anyway, I had this trailer partly built. So I thought, hell, I'll just get that finished up. So I finished it all up, and I had this Ford truck. And I said, listen, let's go, and we'll go to Seattle. So anyway, we pulled it out here to Seattle. And I went to work, and finally, I worked at Boeing's for a while, and starting wages at Boeing was about 65 cents. I got 90 cents because I used to work on fire escapes iron worker. I got a little bit more money, and I worked there about 2 or 3 months. They finally kept shoving a lot of help in with me, and they weren't paying me for no lead man job. And I told them, I said, I want more money, or I'm going to get the hell out of here. They said, well, you can't get out of here. We'll throw you in the Army. And I said, well, like hell. And I remember it was on a lunchtime at night. It was late at night. I picked my toolbox up and went out of there. And I got home, Jesse said, what you doing? I said, I quit that damn place down there. I said, I'm not going to work there anymore. I said, you won't pay me. So what are we going to eat on? I said, the hell, what are we going to eat on? I'll get a job. The next morning I went down to Labor Temple, which is up above downtown at that time. And I goes down there and I asked them about a job. And they says, well, we'll send you out to a place. You can talk it over with and see what you can do. So anyway, I went to HRL, and they done a lot of repair work on ships and stuff, and boats, and made valves, and all kinds of ship repair and that. So anyway, they had all the ferry boat work, and I used to work with a fellow, and we went down and worked on these ferries that run back and forth to Bainbridge Island and Bremerton. And anyway, hell, instead of making 90 cents an hour with that other place, I just started making $1.30 an hour right there. And hell, I got all the overtime I want. I was making 2 to 3 times as much a week as I was at Boeing. And they're the bunch of cheap screws that they ever were. And they hire people from out of here when they wouldn't anyone here. But anyway, I worked for HRL for quite a while, and then finally later on, Jerry had asthma. We used to take him down to a doctor down at the dental building, the medical building. Anyway, this doctor said he could start getting shots and cracks. He just about having a pulse, he's going to choke him. So I said it was right around Christmas time. I said, let's get the hell out of here. And he said, you better get out here. It's no good for him here. It's too dim. So anyway, I talked to Gussie, and I said, let's sell our trailer. We'll go down to California. He said, go inland, a little ways in the water. Go in. It's warmer and drier. So we went down there, and we looked around for a few days, but we thought everything was a damn high price, that we didn't know if we want to stay there or not. Well, I got thinking at the time, we had some friends back in Deadwood. We heard from them before we left Seattle, and they said everything was just cheaper. There was nothing going on. Everything closed down. There wasn't a mine going on or nothing on account of this war business. So anyway, we thought, hell, we'll go back, and maybe I had enough money that I could go in and buy a place where it was a different climate, a drier climate. I remember we bought a triplex for about $6,500. Later on, we sold it for $20,000 after I fixed it up. And then Jerry was feeling better. So we turned around and we come on back to Seattle. I had a truck, and when we was in Deadwood working, I worked for a guy named Gary, run a big creosote plant, and I used to fly around there and be a treating engineer on treating these creosote telephone poles and railroad ties. I worked for him. We were in Deadwood for 9 years, and then we left there and we come to Seattle in 52, and I got a job back in the shipyard working for Todd. Well, I worked there from the beginning of in July the 8th, we started there in 52, and I worked there until right after Christmas. My God, they laid nearly everybody off, even most of the lead men, laid them off. So anyway, I got thinking, well, what the hell we're going to do? I bought a house over in West Seattle, over on 40th Avenue. So I had it before. So anyway, Doug and I, we decided maybe we'd go out and look and buy a motel. So we knew where to buy one. We didn't want to buy one way out in the country. We figured everything gas up and went right in town. So we made a deal. We printed this house for $60,000, $5,000 contract, and we got on the house in that city for a down payment on this motel. We rented it for a couple of years, and we made out pretty good there. And then we finally, after running again, getting close to this talking about a World's Fair, and I said, we're building new motels pretty soon. I said, things will be, so then many of the motels after that fair, we probably won't be much business. So I said, let's sell it. So anyway, I was thinking about selling one because outside of walking on the road after this long little parking strip I have there. Pretty soon, cousin, the guy wants to talk. His name's Clint Johnson. He wants to go and sell it. So I said, I'll do enough talking. And I talked to him. He said, would you sell your place? I said, that all depends. That's what I really want to do is to sell it. He says, well, I know two fellas that live way out the Golden West Motel, way out. They sold their place. They'd like to make some kind of a deal for your place. We only had 12 rooms there, a place to live in. We lived in the main office in the back. We had plenty of room there. So anyway, I says, well, it all depends. I said, we'll sell it if we get the right price. Well, he said, I'll tell you. He said, they'll pay $125,000 for it. Yeah, but they'll have to trade some paper in. I said, what do you mean paper? He said, well, we've got a contract on an apartment house up on Barn Avenue for $25,000. Would you take that on it? And so anyway, I says, well, if it's good, I will. So anyway, we talked about these guys a couple days, the next day, and then about 2 or 3 days time, I said, we sell it. So we made a deal with these guys, and they got in there, and we started out. We moved out up on Green Angeles, place up there in Jackson. We stayed there for several months. Then we went to Magnolia, we bought a house there. Stayed there for a year or so. It was pretty simple. Sold it, we come over to West Seattle, where we're living right now on 46th. So that was it. And all the time, I always worked either in a shipyard or finally I worked for the shipyard, Puget Sound. And then pretty soon a lot. And I worked for Kobe Crags quite a few years, telling people in the cranes and that. And that was pretty good. After that lot, I bought that shipyard, obviously, of course, I worked on maintenance down there, taking care of the cranes, air compressors, and everything. Any kind of repair I was working on it.